There is a place on the western coast of Norway where the mountains fall so steeply into the sea that the water turns black before noon. A place where the fjords carve so deep into the earth that even in summer the cold never quite leaves. Bergen, a city of merchants, of fish markets and painted wooden houses, of rain that comes sideways off the North Sea and soaks through every layer a person owns. For centuries, it was a city that lived by the water, fed by the water, defined entirely by what arrived and departed on its tides. And then, in the spring of 1940, something arrived that would change it forever. The ships that came were not merchant vessels. The men who disembarked were not traders. What descended on Bergen in those early months of the war was something the city had never seen before. The full mechanical weight of a modern military power, deciding, with cold precision, that this particular harbour, these particular waters, this particular geography, was worth more than anything else on the Norwegian coast. The Germans had looked at a map, traced the shipping lanes with a finger, measured the distances to the Atlantic with a ruler, and arrived at a conclusion that would bind Bergen to the war, in ways the city's residents could not yet imagine. What followed over the next 5 years was one of the most concentrated military transformations of any port in the entire war. A harbour that had known the quiet rhythms of commerce was buried under concrete. Hills that had looked down on fishing boats now looked down on something far darker. Long grey shapes moving through the water with deliberate menace, slipping beneath the surface and heading west. Wolf packs, the hunting fleets of Admiral Karl Dönitz, departing from Norwegian waters to tear at the supply lines keeping Britain alive. Bergen was not merely a port, it became a fortress, a nerve centre, a city swallowed whole by the machinery of war. And tonight, that is exactly where we are going. This is the full history of the U-boat base at Bergen, not a summary, not a highlight reel, the entire story, from the moment German forces recognized what this harbour could offer, to the morning Allied forces walked through the gates of a fortress that had outlasted its own purpose. Every chapter, every turning point. The construction that forced thousands of labourers to work until their hands gave out. The patrols that left Bergen in darkness and returned, or did not return. The men who ate and slept and waited inside concrete walls that felt more like a tomb with every passing month. The raids from above that proved no fortress is truly impregnable. And finally, the slow, unglamorous collapse of everything that had been built here, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the way most things end, gradually, then all at once. If you are here to settle in for the night, you are exactly where you should be. This is that kind of story. It does not rush, it does not simplify, it breathes. It follows the full arc of what happens when an enormous military machine stakes everything on a strategic vision and then watches, piece by piece, as that vision is dismantled by a world that refuses to cooperate. There is something deeply human in that story, even when it is told in tons of concrete and nautical miles and fleet tonnage figures, because behind every one of those numbers, there were people, crews of 20, 30, 40 men climbing into steel tubes and sealing the hatch behind them, commanders staring at charts in lamplight, engineers with oil on their hands and no sleep in their eyes, workers who had no choice in being there at all. Bergen holds all of them. The city absorbed this war so completely that even now, decades later, the concrete the Germans poured into the hillsides is still there. You can stand next to it. You can put your hand on it. It does not apologize. It does not explain itself. It simply remains, the way all heavy things remain long after the reasons for their existence have dissolved. So let this be your invitation. If you are watching for the first time, welcome. If you are returning to this channel, you already know what this is. The kind of documentary that treats history with the seriousness it deserves, that follows the evidence rather than the legend, that acknowledges both the scale of what was built here and the scale of the suffering it caused. If this is the kind of storytelling you want more of, then please subscribe. It genuinely matters. It allows this work to continue, and there are many more stories waiting to be told with exactly this much care and exactly this much time. But for now, press nothing. Go nowhere. Let the night settle around you. Because we are going back to Bergen, back to 1940, when the first German boots hit the quayside, and someone looked out at that dark harbour water and thought, yes, this is the one. Back to the years when submarines slid out of these protected fjords and into some of the most brutal naval combat the modern world has ever produced. Back to the moment the tide turned, and a base built for victory began its long reckoning with defeat. And forward, all the way to May of 1945, when the silence that fell over Bergen was not the silence of triumph, but of exhaustion. A city emerging from occupation, a harbour still holding the wreckage of what had been built inside it. This is more than a military history, though it is absolutely that. It is a study in what happens when geography becomes destiny, when a harbour becomes a headquarters, when a city becomes an instrument of war without anyone asking the city's permission. The mountains above Bergen kept their silence through all of it. The fjords did not move. The rain came and went, the way it always has, indifferent to what happened on the water below. The world down there changed entirely, and when it was over, Bergen remained, older, scarred, carrying something in its stone walls that no amount of post-war commerce could completely erase. That something is what this documentary is about. Find yourself a comfortable position. Let your breathing slow. You do not need to hold tension for this one. Let it go. The story will carry you. It knows exactly where it is going. Bergen is waiting. Bergen sits at the edge of the world the way old port cities often do, half turned toward the sea, half anchored to the mountains behind it. 7 peaks ring the city like a rough crown, and between them and the dark water of the Puddefjord, a civilization had quietly grown over centuries. Fishing boats, merchant vessels, the slow commerce of timber and dried cod, these were the rhythms that Bergen had known for generations. The harbour was busy in the way that working ports are always busy, purposefully, without drama, without grand ambition. Rain fell more than 300 days a year, and the people who lived there had made a kind of peace with that grey constancy. They were a maritime people in the truest sense, not romantic about the sea, but deeply dependent upon it. Their city had survived fires, plagues, and the slow economic transformations that reshaped northern Europe across the centuries. What Bergen had never seriously contemplated was becoming a target. The spring of 1940 changed that, with a violence that still echoes. Germany's invasion of Norway, launched in the early hours of the 9th of April 1940, was among the most audacious military operations of the entire war. It was not a gradual encroachment or a diplomatic strangulation. It was a simultaneous strike across an entire sovereign nation, delivered from the sea and sky at once. German warships appeared in Norwegian fjords before dawn had properly broken. Paratroopers descended on airfields. Infantry poured ashore at port after port along a coastline that stretched for more than 2,000 kilometers. The speed and coordination of it left the Norwegian government and its military reeling, trying to respond to an enemy that had already arrived in force before any coherent defense could be organized. In Bergen, German forces came by sea, entering the harbour under fire from the Kvarven and Sandviken shore batteries. The Norwegians fought. They exacted a cost, but by the close of that same day, the city was in German hands. The Norwegian campaign did not end cleanly or quickly. Allied forces, British, French, and Polish, landed further north in an attempt to contest the German seizure of the country. Fighting continued for nearly 2 months, brutal and often confused across unfamiliar terrain of snow and rock and dense forest. But the arithmetic of power was not in Norway's favour, and Allied attention was suddenly and catastrophically diverted by the German invasion of France and the Low Countries in May. Norway was abandoned to its fate. By the 10th of June 1940, the last Norwegian and Allied resistance in the north had been extinguished. The country was now under German occupation, and Bergen was no longer a quiet merchant port. It was a prize, and within the higher echelons of German naval command, the full meaning of that prize was already being calculated with considerable excitement. Admiral Karl Dönitz had been pressing the case for Atlantic submarine warfare long before the war began. His doctrine was built on a simple but devastating logic. Britain was an island nation entirely dependent on sea lanes for its survival. Sever those lanes, sink the merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and raw materials across the Atlantic, and Britain would be strangled into submission without a single soldier crossing the English Channel. The submarines he commanded were the instrument of that strategy, and for those submarines to operate effectively in the Atlantic, they needed bases. Before Norway fell, German U-boats had been operating primarily from German ports on the North Sea coast, and increasingly from ports on the French Atlantic coast seized in the aftermath of France's collapse. These were useful, but Bergen offered something the others could not. The geography of western Norway is unlike almost anywhere else in Europe. The fjords cut deep into the landmass, carving sheltered channels of extraordinary depth from the open sea far into the heart of the mountains. Bergen sits at the confluence of several such channels, and the waters around it are naturally protected from the full fury of North Sea weather. For a submarine, which is a fragile instrument despite its menacing reputation, shelter matters enormously. A U-boat returning from weeks at sea with a damaged hull, a malfunctioning torpedo tube, or an exhausted crew needed calm water, reliable facilities, and protection from enemy air attack. Bergen could offer all of these things, and something more. It offered proximity. From Bergen, a U-boat could reach the open North Atlantic in a fraction of the time it took from a port further south or east. The British shipping lanes that carried the lifeblood of the Allied war effort passed within striking distance. Convoys bound for Britain from North America, convoys carrying supplies north toward the Soviet Union, Royal Navy patrols threading through the waters between Scotland and Iceland. All of these could be reached more rapidly and attacked more efficiently by submarines departing from Bergen than from almost any alternative base. German naval planners looking at the map in the early weeks of the occupation would have seen something close to an ideal configuration: a deep, sheltered harbour, backed by defensible mountains, served by a reasonable road and rail network, separated from the enemy by the manageable width of the North Sea. The mathematical attractiveness of Bergen as a forward submarine base was, to a military mind trained in logistics and operational geometry, very nearly irresistible. There was also the question of what Bergen might protect from. A submarine base is only as valuable as its security, and in 1940, the German military's greatest fear was not what lay to the east, but what approached from the sky and the sea to the west. The Royal Navy remained a formidable force, and the Royal Air Force, though stretched, retained the capacity for offensive action. Any base along the French Atlantic coast was, in principle, reachable by British aircraft operating from southern England. Bergen was further away, not comfortably so, but at a distance that complicated British bombing missions and required longer range and more complex planning. The mountains themselves provided natural camouflage and potential fortification points. German engineers who surveyed the area in the weeks following the city's capture noted the topography with the particular appreciation of people who understood how to turn landscape into defense. The civilian population of Bergen became, from that spring onward, inhabitants of an occupied city, a condition that settled over their daily lives with a weight that was invisible in the first days, but accumulated steadily into something crushing. German soldiers patrolled streets that Norwegian fishermen had walked for generations. Military vehicles navigated roads built for fishing carts and merchant wagons. The harbour that had been the economic heart of the community was now being assessed, measured, and redesignated for a purpose entirely alien to everything Bergen had been built for. Norwegian merchant sailors who had operated out of the port for their entire careers found themselves displaced, their livelihoods severed, their relationship with the sea now mediated by an occupying power that viewed their harbour as a military installation and viewed them as a security concern at best, a labour resource at worst. German command in the early occupation period was not immediately focused on submarine infrastructure. The conquest itself demanded attention, and the political architecture of occupation required establishment before the military architecture of fortress building could begin. Berlin appointed a Reichskommissar to govern Norway, and the machinery of occupation, rationing, censorship, surveillance, forced labour registration, ground into operation with the systematic efficiency that characterized German administrative control throughout occupied Europe. Bergen was brought within this system, its civic institutions subordinated to German authority, its resources placed at German disposal. The harbour's commercial function did not disappear overnight, but its character transformed irrevocably the moment the first German garrison took up positions at the dockside, and the first military assessors walked the quays with notebooks in hand. By the latter months of 1940, the outlines of what Bergen would become were already taking shape in German naval planning documents. The harbour's existing port infrastructure, its quays, its warehouses, its repair facilities, was useful but insufficient for a major submarine base. What was needed was something purpose-built on a scale that existing facilities could not begin to approach. The U-boat arm was growing. New submarines were completing construction and commissioning. Crews were being trained, torpedo reserves were being accumulated, and the operational tempo of the Atlantic campaign was intensifying with every month that passed. Bergen would need to be transformed, not merely occupied and adapted, but fundamentally rebuilt, at enormous cost, with enormous labour, into something that had no real precedent in the history of Norwegian maritime infrastructure. The decision to make Bergen a principal U-boat base carried with it an implicit acknowledgement that Germany was committing to a long war at sea. A facility of the scale being contemplated was not something that could be built quickly or cheaply or abandoned without consequence. It would require years of construction, vast quantities of concrete and steel, thousands of workers, and an administrative organization capable of sustaining a major naval installation through whatever the war brought. The Germans were prepared to make that commitment because the men at the top of the naval command structure believed that the Atlantic campaign could be decisive, that if enough merchant tonnage could be sunk, quickly enough, Britain could be forced to terms before American industrial power fully entered the equation. Bergen was not merely a convenient harbour. In that strategic calculus, it was something closer to a potential war winner. And so, on the rain-grey quays of a Norwegian port city that had once sent its boats out for cod and timber, a different kind of departure was being planned. Not for Bergen's own people, who had no say in what was coming, but for the grey wolves of the U-boat fleet, machines of war that would use Bergen's sheltered waters as a launching point into some of the most brutal naval fighting in human history. The mountains watched in their impassive way, the rain fell, and the engineers were already on their way. The decision had already been made in the upper floors of German Naval Command, long before the first engineer set foot on Bergen's waterfront. What the harbour represented, its deep anchorages, its sheltered approaches, its proximity to the open Atlantic, demanded permanence. A temporary arrangement would not serve Dönitz's ambitions, and temporary arrangements were not how the Reich built its power. What was needed was something that would outlast the war itself, something carved so deeply into the Norwegian rock that no enemy bomb, no enemy fleet, no act of God or man could erase it. By 1941, the plans had hardened from vision into blueprint, and the blueprints had become orders, and orders had set an enormous machinery of construction into grinding, relentless motion. Wehrmacht engineers arrived in the early months of that year, carrying surveys, calculations, and the particular confidence of men who believed they were building something that would stand for a generation. Its citizens had watched German soldiers take up positions along streets they had walked since childhood. Now they would watch something else entirely, the systematic physical transformation of their harbour into a citadel. The engineers walked the waterfront with measuring instruments and notebooks, and where they pointed, labourers would soon follow. The scale of what was being planned did not reveal itself all at once. It emerged the way a great structure always does, first in the movement of men and materials, then in the tearing up of earth, and finally in the slow, massive accumulation of form. The facility that would take shape at Bergen was not improvised. German military engineers had already overseen similar projects elsewhere along the occupied coastline of Europe, and they brought with them hard-won knowledge about what a submarine base required to function under wartime pressure. The fundamental requirement was concrete, enormous quantities of it, poured in configurations designed to defeat not just weather and water, but bombs falling from altitude. The engineering doctrine that governed construction was built on a single grim premise, that the Allies would eventually try to destroy what Germany was building, and that the structure must be able to absorb that punishment and survive. This was not paranoia, it was professional foresight, and it shaped every decision about thickness, reinforcement, and design. The bunker pens themselves were conceived on a scale that still arrests the imagination. Individual submarine berths had to accommodate vessels of considerable size, sheltering them while crews rested, while torpedoes were loaded, while engines were overhauled, while hulls were patched and pressure tested. The roof structures that would shield these berths were not simply thick, they were engineered as interlocking systems of reinforced concrete, layer upon layer, designed to dissipate the energy of a bomb before it could reach what lay beneath. Workers poured concrete continuously, in shifts that recognized no boundary between day and night, because the concrete could not be allowed to cure unevenly, and because the war was moving and the schedule was absolute. The sound of that construction, the grinding of mixers, the hammering of formwork, the deep concussive thuds of tamping and settling, became the new ambient noise of Bergen's waterfront. The labour force assembled for this work was vast, and the conditions under which much of it operated were a source of something that German commanders preferred not to examine too directly. Norwegian workers were present, some employed, some coerced, existing in the complicated moral territory of occupation where refusal carried its own dangers. But the heaviest and most dangerous work fell disproportionately on men who had no choice at all. Prisoners of war, laborers conscripted from occupied territories across Europe, men who had been transported to Norway in circumstances that left them entirely without recourse. These were the hands that mixed the concrete and drove the reinforcing rods into the rock. They worked in cold that the Norwegian winter delivered without mercy. They worked with inadequate food, inadequate clothing, inadequate rest. The fortress that German engineers designed with such professional precision was built, in significant part, by men being consumed in its construction. The organizational structure that managed this labor force was administered under the umbrella of a German paramilitary construction organization whose reach extended across occupied Europe, coordinating enormous civilian building projects in service of military objectives. In Norway, as elsewhere, the machinery of this organization processed human labor as efficiently as it processed materials, logging inputs, tracking outputs, and maintaining a systematic indifference to the suffering that its methods produced. Supervisors answered to engineers who answered to military commanders who answered to priorities set far away. The individual man breaking rock on Bergen's waterfront existed at the end of a very long chain of authority that had no interest in his condition beyond his continued capacity to work. Alongside the submarine pens, the broader infrastructure of the base began to take form with equal urgency. Fuel storage facilities were excavated into the hillsides surrounding the harbour, placing vital reserves beneath the protection of solid Norwegian rock. The principle was the same one that governed the submarine pens. If it cannot be seen from above, it cannot be bombed from above. Pipelines connected these buried reservoirs to the waterfront, running through conduits themselves encased in concrete, allowing fuel to flow to submarines without exposure at any point along the route. Ammunition storage followed similar logic. Torpedo maintenance facilities, battery charging stations, crew accommodation blocks, medical facilities, communications centers. Each element of the base was positioned and constructed according to a master plan that treated the entire harbour area as a single integrated system. The repair capabilities being established at Bergen were, in their own way, as significant as the bunkers themselves. A submarine returning from a North Atlantic patrol was rarely in pristine condition. It had been depth-charged, storm-battered, pushed to the limit of its mechanical tolerances by weeks of hard running. The base needed the capacity to receive these vessels and restore them to operational readiness in the shortest possible time, because every day a submarine sat in a berth unable to sail was a day it was not sinking Allied shipping. Machine shops were equipped with lathes, welding rigs, and precision tooling. Dry dock facilities allowed hull inspections below the waterline. Electrical workshops handled the complex battery systems that submarine operations depended upon. The men who staffed these facilities were skilled, machinists, electricians, welders, and they understood that the quality of their work directly determined whether the crews they serviced lived or died on the next patrol. Through the course of 1941, the base grew from a construction site into something recognizable as a military installation. The concrete structures that had existed only as blueprints now rose above the waterline as physical facts. The submarine pens, not yet complete, already communicated through their sheer mass the ambition that had produced them. German naval officers who visited the site during this period saw what they had ordered and understood that they had ordered something extraordinary, a base that would not merely support submarine operations, but would define them, anchoring the Atlantic campaign to a specific piece of Norwegian geography, with the finality of an anchor chain dropped to the seabed. Bergen was not a waypoint. It was becoming a permanent center of gravity for German naval power in the North Atlantic. The garrison that accompanied the construction was itself a significant military presence. Security perimeters expanded as the base took shape, because what was being built had to be protected from the moment its importance became apparent, and its importance became apparent almost immediately. Norwegian resistance networks watched the construction with the particular helpless fury of people witnessing something being done to their homeland that they lacked the means to prevent. Intelligence about the base's development was passed through clandestine channels to Allied authorities in London, adding urgency to Allied planning around how Bergen might eventually be addressed. The German security apparatus understood that information was leaking and responded with tightened protocols and periodic crackdowns, a dynamic that would persist for the duration of the occupation. By the time the principal construction phases were approaching completion, Bergen's transformation had become total. The harbour that Norwegian fishermen and merchant sailors had known, the working, human-scaled port of a trading city, had become something else. The concrete structures that dominated the waterfront had a quality that was almost geological in their permanence, as though they had risen from the bedrock by natural process rather than human labour. That sense of permanence was entirely intentional. German military planners wanted a base that communicated not just capability, but endurance. A structure that told anyone who saw it that the power behind it was not going away. In 1941, with the Reich at the peak of its territorial reach, there was every reason to believe the message was accurate. What those planners could not yet know, and perhaps could not have permitted themselves to contemplate, was that the permanence they were building into the rock of Bergen would far outlast the cause it was built to serve. The concrete would remain. The galleries cut into the hillside would remain. The berths, the tunnels, the reinforced walls that had absorbed the labour of so many broken men, all of it would remain, long after the submarines that sheltered there had rusted into the seabed, long after the engineers who designed the calculations had passed into history, long after the ideology that demanded this fortress had been dismantled and condemned. Construction is an act of faith in continuity, and Bergen's builders had faith in abundance. Whether that faith was justified would take years to determine, and the determination, when it finally came, would arrive in ways no engineer's blueprint could have anticipated. Bergen had become something new, not merely a port, not simply a base, but a living organ in the body of Germany's submarine war. By the time the concrete had cured and the first repair cranes swung into operation, Admiral Karl Dönitz understood what he had been given. He had spent years arguing for submarines, fighting the naval establishment for resources, pushing against admirals who still believed in battleships and prestige. Now, here in the sheltered waters of western Norway, his vision had a home. Bergen was not just a harbour that happened to have U-boats. Bergen was the philosophical centre of a campaign that Dönitz believed, with absolute conviction, could strangle Britain into submission before a single Allied boot touched European soil. The Admiral's strategy rested on a single brutal calculation. Britain was an island. Islands depend on what ships bring them: food, fuel, steel, ammunition, the entire metabolism of a fighting nation. If enough of those ships could be sunk fast enough, the arithmetic would become irreversible. Losses would outpace construction. Convoys would stop sailing. The island would wither. Dönitz had worked through the numbers obsessively, and the numbers told him the campaign was winnable, provided he had enough submarines operating simultaneously across enough ocean. Bergen answered that need in ways that the bases on the French Atlantic coast, valuable as they were, simply could not. The Norwegian harbour put his boats closer to the northern convoy routes, to the passages between Iceland and Scotland, to the frigid waters where Allied merchant shipping moved in dense and vulnerable columns. Distance meant fuel. Fuel meant time at sea. Time at sea meant tonnage sunk. The wolf pack doctrine that Dönitz refined was not improvised. It had been worked out on paper, tested in exercises, debated in strategy sessions, and now it was being executed at scale. The idea was deceptively simple. A single submarine could be evaded, hunted, depth-charged, and sunk. A coordinated group of submarines, guided by radio signals from shore command and attacking simultaneously from multiple angles, was a different problem entirely. Convoy escorts built around a threat approaching from one direction could not simultaneously protect against threats from 3 or 4. When Bergen dispatched multiple boats into the Atlantic as part of a coordinated hunting group, the math of convoy protection became terrible for the Allies. Merchant captains and escort commanders faced a geometry of threat that had no clean solution, and Dönitz's men exploited that geometry with cold efficiency. Running Bergen as a hub for this campaign required organizational precision that matched the tactical ambition. The base needed to keep boats in the water as continuously as possible, which meant that the time spent in port had to be managed with the same discipline as the time spent on patrol. When a submarine returned to Bergen, battered and exhausted, the process of returning it to operational readiness began immediately. Fuel lines connected before the gangways were fully secured. Torpedoes were inventoried and replacements loaded. Hull inspections identified damage that the crew had patched at sea, but which needed proper repair to survive another patrol. Diesel engines were inspected, bearings checked, compressors serviced. The machinery of a submarine is unforgiving, and Bergen's workshops understood that a boat sent back to sea with unresolved faults was a boat unlikely to return. Crew rotation was perhaps the most demanding logistical challenge the base managed. U-boat patrols were not simply tiring. They were psychologically consuming in ways that surface warfare rarely matched. Men lived for weeks inside a steel cylinder, breathing recycled air, sleeping in shifts, eating cold food, listening for sounds that might mean a depth charge was about to end everything. When they came ashore at Bergen, many were not simply tired, they were wrung out in ways that a few nights' sleep could not fully address. The base administration developed a rhythm that tried to balance the operational pressure for boats at sea with the human requirement for genuine recovery. Rest facilities, modest by any peacetime standard but prized after weeks underwater, gave crews the chance to decompress before commanders began talking about the next patrol. Officers received briefings. Crews received letters from home. The machinery of morale, understood by Dönitz as essential to maintaining fighting effectiveness, was applied with as much care as the machinery of torpedoes. Supply logistics connecting Bergen to the broader German war economy ran through channels that were constantly at risk of disruption. Fuel arrived by tanker from German-controlled ports, a journey that was never comfortable as Allied aircraft extended their operational range. Torpedoes were manufactured in facilities far from Norway and transported north through supply networks that required careful coordination to prevent shortfalls. Food, spare parts, specialized tools, optical equipment for periscopes, materials for acoustic systems, everything that a functioning submarine base needed had to travel to Bergen from sources spread across occupied Europe. The base logistics staff maintained inventories with a discipline born of necessity. Running short of torpedoes when a wolf pack was forming, was not a planning failure. It was a catastrophe that would echo in convoy losses not taken and shipping not sunk. The radio infrastructure supporting Bergen's role as a nerve center deserves particular attention, because it was through radio that Dönitz commanded his campaign. Boats at sea reported contacts. Shore command directed movements. Wolf packs assembled through a series of transmitted instructions that, if decoded by the Allies, would have been devastatingly revealing. Bergen served as a relay point and communication hub, its antenna facilities connecting the Admiral's headquarters to boats scattered across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of ocean. The traffic was constant, technical, and encoded with systems that German signals staff believed to be unbreakable. The confidence was not entirely misplaced at this stage of the war. The Allies were working furiously to penetrate German naval codes, and progress was being made. But for the period when Bergen was at its operational peak, the communications net functioned more or less as designed. The harbour itself had been transformed from its peacetime character in ways that would have astonished any merchant sailor who had known it before the war. Buoys marked approach channels, and strict movement protocols governed when and how submarines could enter and leave. Surface vessels patrolled the outer approaches, coordinating with shore-based defences against the possibility of Allied naval intrusion. Anti-aircraft installations watched the sky, their crews knowing that the base's visibility and importance made it a target. Below all of this, in the sheltered concrete pens that now lined sections of the waterfront, dozens of submarines could rest simultaneously, their bulk invisible from the air and protected from the blast effects of bombs by meters of reinforced concrete above. From outside, Bergen looked like a city at war. From inside the fortress perimeter, it was a city within a war, self-contained, purposeful, and in the early years of full operation, relentlessly confident. The men who commanded individual boats departing Bergen carried responsibility that is difficult to overstate. A U-boat commander at sea was genuinely alone in a way that almost no other military commander of the period experienced. Land commanders could call for support, retreat, dig in, resupply. Commanders of surface warships had other ships around them. A submarine captain, once submerged in the Atlantic, had only his crew, his boat, his training, and his judgment. The quality of that judgment determined whether the boat returned. Bergen provided the best preparation it could. Detailed intelligence briefings on convoy routes, weather reports, known Allied patrol patterns. But once the boat slipped beneath the surface of the Hardanger fjord and headed west into open water, the commander was entirely his own authority. The weight of that authority, multiplied across every boat the base dispatched, shaped the culture of the entire installation. Bergen respected competence because competence was survival. Success, in the years when Bergen was functioning at its intended capacity, was measured in tonnage. The accounting was precise and celebrated. Boats returning with confirmed kills brought their crews into a hierarchy of achievement that the base enthusiastically maintained. The tonnage war was Dönitz's chosen metric because it was the one that connected individual submarine operations to strategic outcome. Every 1,000 tons of Allied shipping sent to the ocean floor was a step toward the calculation the Admiral had made, toward the point at which losses would outstrip Allied capacity to replace them. Bergen fed this campaign with boats, maintained those boats, rested their crews, and dispatched them again. The cycle, when it was working, had an almost industrial quality. Production of a specific output, measured against targets, organized for maximum efficiency. What Bergen also produced, though this was harder to count and rarely discussed openly, was loss. Not every boat returned. Not every crew recovered from a patrol without men who had been there at departure. The base maintained records, and the records were honest about the arithmetic of attrition, even when commanders preferred to speak of victories. A submarine base is a place of departure and return, and when the return does not come, the departure becomes something else in memory. Bergen's senior staff understood this. They continued the operations because the campaign demanded it, and because the strategic logic had not yet broken down. But the knowledge that they were sending men into circumstances from which some would not emerge was present in every briefing room, every torpedo loading exercise, every farewell on a rain-slicked dock. Bergen at its peak was not simply a triumph of military organization. It was a machine built from human courage, human expertise, and the willingness of human beings to accept odds that were already, in ways not yet fully visible, beginning to shift against them. Bergen no longer belonged to Norway. Not really. The port that fishermen had known for generations, the quays where merchant captains had argued over freight rates and weather windows, had been absorbed into something colder and more absolute. The German military machine had taken the harbour's bones and rebuilt them according to a different logic entirely, one of control, of function, of secrecy sealed beneath layers of concrete and wire. By the time the base reached its operational stride in the early months of 1942, it had become a world within a world. Visitors who passed through the outer checkpoints often remarked on the sensation of crossing a threshold, of leaving one kind of existence and entering another that operated by entirely its own rules. Those rules were not posted on walls. They did not need to be. Every man who arrived at Bergen understood them within hours of his first patrol briefing. At the top of the hierarchy sat the base commander, and beneath him a structure as rigid as the reinforced concrete overhead. Staff officers occupied the upper floors of commandeered buildings along the waterfront, their windows overlooking the submarine pens with a proprietorial authority. Engineering officers ran the repair yards with an almost religious devotion to schedule and specification. Supply officers fought daily battles against the logistics of keeping a major naval installation fed, fueled, and functional at the end of a supply chain that stretched back through occupied Europe. Each rank carried its own weight of responsibility, its own particular anxiety, and the men at the top understood better than anyone that the entire enterprise rested on their ability to maintain momentum. A U-boat that sat idle for want of a part was a U-boat that did not sink tonnage, and tonnage was the currency by which Admiral Dönitz measured everything. Below the officers, the backbone of the base was its technical workforce. Hundreds of mechanics, welders, electricians, and hull specialists worked in shifts that recognized neither day nor night, driven by the simple mathematics of boats returning damaged and boats needing to depart on schedule. The concrete pens hummed with the sound of compressed air lines and grinding machinery. Men worked by floodlight in the small hours of the morning, lying flat against a pressure hull to reach a failed fitting, or descending into the cramped engineering spaces of a submarine to replace components that had been stressed beyond their tolerances by weeks at depth. These men were skilled, and they knew it, and that knowledge gave them a status that crossed some of the formal divisions of rank. An experienced machinist who could diagnose a fault that had stumped 3 junior officers commanded a quiet respect that no amount of paperwork could manufacture. The U-boat crews themselves occupied a peculiar position within this world. They were the reason for everything, the purpose around which the entire installation revolved, and yet during the weeks they spent ashore between patrols, they existed in a state of enforced suspension. Rest was not merely encouraged, it was mandated, A crew returned from the North Atlantic was not permitted to simply wander back into the routine of the base. There were medical assessments, debriefings that could last days, and a carefully managed period of recovery that the naval authorities understood was as operationally necessary as any repair to the hull. The men who had spent weeks compressed into the steel cylinder of a submarine, breathing recycled air and sleeping in rotation in bunks that still smelled of the last occupant, needed something approximating human normality before they could function again. Accommodation within the base ranged from the adequate to the genuinely grim, depending on rank and role. Officers were quartered in requisitioned buildings near the harbour, with something approaching comfort: proper beds, shared mess facilities, the occasional supply of decent food when convoys from the south had run successfully. Enlisted crew members and technical ratings lived in barracks arrangements that prioritized capacity over comfort. The walls were cold, the heating was unreliable in winter, and the Norwegian winters were not forgiving. Men slept in their uniforms on bad nights. They ate from field kitchens when the supply situation tightened, and they learned not to complain about it, because complaining changed nothing, and exhausted energy better saved for everything else. Security at Bergen was not simply tight, it was total. The perimeter of the installation was defined by layers of checkpoints, wire barriers, and patrol routes that left no gap large enough for complacency. Norwegian civilians who lived near the base were subject to movement restrictions and surveillance that touched every aspect of daily life. German counterintelligence personnel moved through the base population with a quiet, persistent attention, watching for anything that suggested contact with the outside world, with resistance networks, or with the Allied intelligence apparatus that was known to be operating in Norway. Every piece of correspondence that entered or left the base passed through sensors. Every telephone call of any significance was logged. The base commander understood that the security of Bergen was not only about preventing physical attack, it was about preventing information from leaking north and west to those who would use it to send bombers. For the Norwegian workers who found themselves inside the installation's orbit, the experience was one of profound and degrading powerlessness. Forced labor had built much of the infrastructure and continued to maintain it. These men worked under guard, were housed separately from German personnel, and operated under a set of rules that made clear their status in explicit and daily terms. Some had arrived at the base through the labor conscription systems that the occupation authorities imposed across the country. Others had been drawn in more gradually, through economic desperation and the simple fact that refusing work under occupation carried consequences that extended beyond the individual to their families. They were not invisible to the German personnel. They were everywhere, doing the heavy and unpleasant work. But the base's social architecture ensured they remained categorically apart. The rhythm of the base was governed by arrivals and departures, and the emotional texture of life inside Bergen shifted in register with each. When a boat came home, when the grey shape of a U-boat nosed into the pen after weeks at sea, its crew thin and pale and salt-worn, there was something that moved through the base like a current. Relief, surely, for those who had waited, but also a practical urgency, because a boat in harbour was a boat being prepared for the next patrol, and the machinery of preparation began almost before the lines were made fast. The crew would be taken to debrief, the boat would be handed to the technical teams, and within days the cycle would begin again. There was very little ceremony in the middle stages of the war. The early pageantry of departures and arrivals had given way to something more businesslike, more compressed. Meals in the officers' mess followed a structure that borrowed from the formality of peacetime naval tradition, even as the content on the table reflected the realities of wartime supply. A A certain amount of theatre was maintained, place settings, a degree of dress, because routine and ritual were understood to be structurally important. Without them, the peculiar psychological pressure of the base, the knowledge of what lay beyond its perimeter and what lay beneath the Atlantic, had a way of finding cracks in a man's composure. The senior officers who ran Bergen had seen what happened to men who stopped maintaining the habits of order, and they discouraged it firmly. The junior officers who sat at those mess tables and made conversation about things other than the war were performing a kind of necessary maintenance on themselves, and most of them knew it. Among the enlisted sailors, the social world was smaller and more immediate. The bonds formed inside a submarine crew were among the tightest forged by any branch of the military, born of the particular intimacy of confined space and shared danger. At Bergen, those bonds translated into a social life, conducted in groups that rarely mixed with outsiders. A crew drank together, slept in adjacent bunks, recovered together, and when the time came, boarded together again. They developed private languages of reference and humor that no one outside their boat entirely understood. New replacements assigned to fill dead men's billets had to be absorbed into these tight formations, and that absorption was not always easy or gentle. The men who had survived patrols together were not cold towards newcomers, but they were not immediately open either. Trust at those depths was earned slowly, and the mathematics of who had made how many patrols was always present. What the base could not provide, no matter how elaborate its structures or how well drilled its routines, was any genuine distance from the knowledge of what the work cost. Bergen processed information about losses, boats overdue, boats reported sunk, crews listed as missing, and that information moved through the base in ways that official channels could not entirely control. A man knew which boats had left before his and had not returned. He had watched certain faces disappear from the mess table. The technical staff who prepared a boat for departure and then waited to service it on return understood, with the quiet clarity of arithmetic, that not all of their work was coming back. The base was efficient. It was disciplined. It was in many respects a remarkable feat of military organization, sustained at the end of a long and contested supply line. But it was also a place where men lived in close daily proximity to an awareness they could not speak aloud and could not entirely suppress. The concrete walls that kept the outside world out also sealed that knowledge in, and it accumulated there in the silences between meals, in the look exchanged between two men when a name was mentioned that would not be mentioned again. The Atlantic Ocean in the early years of the war was not a battlefield in any conventional sense. There were no fixed lines, no trenches, no hills to capture or hold. It was an expanse of cold grey water, stretching thousands of kilometers in every direction, and the men who fought across it did so in conditions that defied ordinary military imagination. Merchant ships crossed in loose formations called convoys, shepherded by escort vessels that were often too few, too slow, or too lightly armed for the enemy they faced. Beneath the surface, German U-boats moved like predators through dark water, waiting for the moment when a gap in the escort screen would open just wide enough. From Bergen, these boats departed with full fuel tanks, fresh torpedoes, and crews rested enough to believe, at least for the first hours of a patrol, that the odds still favored them. The passage from Bergen into open ocean took a U-boat through the Norwegian Sea and out into the North Atlantic, a journey measured not just in kilometers, but in hours of tension. Enemy aircraft patrolled the coastlines. British submarines lurked in the approaches. The departure itself was a kind of reckoning, a moment when every officer aboard reviewed his charts and made his private calculations about what the next several weeks might bring. Bergen's harbour would shrink behind them as they moved north or west toward the convoy routes, and the men below deck would occupy themselves with maintenance, with card games, with sleep, with any distraction that kept the mind from dwelling too long on the arithmetic of survival. The base had given them everything it could. Now the ocean would take them somewhere its preparation could not follow. When the wolf packs found a convoy, the attack rarely came in daylight. Night operations gave the submarines their best cover, the surface dark enough to reduce the risk of visual detection, while still allowing commanders to coordinate with other boats in the pack. A signal would go out from the first boat to sight the convoy, and over the following hours, the other submarines would converge on the position, working into attack range while the escorts scanned the water with whatever instruments they had available. The merchant ships moved at the speed of their slowest vessel, which made them predictable. A good U-boat commander could place his boat ahead of the convoy, submerge, wait for the columns of ships to pass directly into his firing solution, and release his torpedoes into the formation before the escorts could react. In the best engagements, from the German perspective, several boats attacked simultaneously from different angles, overwhelming the escort commander's ability to respond to any one threat, while the others pressed home their attacks. Bergen's status as a major operational base meant that its U-boats were not marginal contributors to the Atlantic campaign. They were among its central actors. The boats that rotated through the Norwegian harbour took part in the same engagements that filled the war diary entries of Allied naval commands with increasingly grim numbers. Tankers went down with their fuel still burning. Cargo ships carrying food, ammunition, and machinery settled slowly beneath the surface. Troop transports, the loss of which carried a human cost that raw tonnage figures could not capture, were struck and sunk by torpedoes launched from submarines that had provisioned at Bergen, maintained their engines at Bergen's workshops, and received their operational orders from commanders whose offices sat behind Bergen's concrete walls. The harbour was not simply a support facility. It was the origin point of a campaign that threatened to sever the Allied lifeline across the Atlantic. The language used to describe success in this campaign was deliberately industrial. Tonnage sunk, ships destroyed, records set. German Naval Command measured the progress of the U-boat war in gross registered tons, a metric that transformed human catastrophe into accountable achievement. Commanders who returned to Bergen with high scores were met with recognition, promotions, decorations, the attention of superiors who needed good news to carry upward through the chain of command. There was a culture of competition among U-boat crews, a quiet but persistent ranking of who had sunk the most, who had survived the longest patrol, who had slipped through the tightest escort screen. Bergen was where those reputations were built and confirmed, where returning crews debriefed over charts, spread on tables in rooms that smelled of oil and damp stone, describing their engagements in precise technical terms while trying to leave no gap through which doubt might enter. But the Atlantic was not a ledger. It was a place where men died in circumstances that the language of tonnage could not accommodate. Allied merchant sailors, men who had not chosen to be in a war, found themselves in the water when their ships went down, sometimes in seas cold enough to kill within minutes. Escort commanders watched their charges disappear beneath the surface and made decisions under fire about whether to pursue the attacking submarine or circle back to pick up survivors. These were not abstract strategic choices. They were moments in which one kind of death was weighed against another kind of death, and the men who made those calculations lived with them long afterward. The Atlantic campaign, seen from above in the blue light of a command room map, looked like lines and arrows and tonnage figures. Seen from the water, it looked like something else entirely. U-boats returning to Bergen carried their own weight of experience. The patrols lasted weeks, sometimes longer. The interior of a submarine on a long Atlantic patrol was a study in controlled deprivation. Cramped, humid, smelling of diesel and bodies and whatever food remained edible at the end of a voyage. Crew members slept in shifts, sharing bunks still warm from the previous occupant, in spaces so narrow that turning over required deliberate effort. The psychological pressure of operating underwater, of enduring depth charge attacks that bent the hull and shattered gauges and knocked men from their feet, accumulated across the weeks of a patrol into something that no amount of leave in Bergen could entirely dissolve. The men who returned did so quieter than they had left, with a particular look around the eyes that their officers understood well enough not to ask about directly. The celebrations that greeted successful crews in Bergen were genuine, not staged. Men who came back with strong engagement records were welcomed as proof that the campaign still worked, that the mathematics of the tonnage war still favored Germany. Brass bands played at the dock when conditions allowed, and the occasion warranted it. Senior officers made appearances. Speeches acknowledged achievements in the clipped formal language of naval command. Beneath the ceremony, experienced men knew what the numbers also showed, that not every boat that left Bergen would come back, that some crews were simply gone, reported overdue, and then quietly removed from the active roster. Bergen was large enough to absorb these losses without appearing to flinch, at least in the early years when the gap between departures and returns had not yet grown wide enough to change the atmosphere of the place. The wolf pack system that made Bergen so central to the Atlantic campaign depended on coordination that was impressive by the standards of the time. Boats were directed to convoy positions by radio traffic transmitted from shore-based command facilities. A U-boat somewhere in the central Atlantic, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest land, could receive updated intelligence about convoy positions and routing changes, and use that information to reposition itself or vector other boats in the pack toward a target. Bergen's facilities supported this system by ensuring boats were operationally ready, fully fueled, fully armed, their communications equipment functioning, their commanders briefed on current Allied routing patterns. The base was the circulatory center through which the whole system breathed, and its efficiency in the early years of the campaign was a genuine operational achievement by any measure. What nobody at Bergen, or anywhere in the German naval command structure, wanted to acknowledge openly in these peak years was that the campaign's success rested on conditions that could change. The convoys had not yet developed the escort strength or the detection technology to make submerged attack reliably dangerous for the attacking boat. Aircraft did not yet reach the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats operated most freely. Allied shipbuilding had not yet ramped to the point where new vessels replaced losses faster than they occurred. The whole structure of German advantage in the Atlantic was built on a set of circumstances that depended on Allied limitations remaining fixed, and Allied limitations had a way of not remaining fixed. The men in Bergen's operations rooms understood this at some level, though the understanding was rarely spoken aloud in terms that invited honest examination of what it might eventually mean. For now, in the years when the Atlantic campaign burned at its most intense, Bergen was exactly what German naval planners had imagined it could be when they first studied that Norwegian harbour on their charts. The deep water held the boats. The workshops kept them running. The supply chain fed them and armed them. The crews rotated through, rested and then departed, and the ocean accepted them one by one as they steered west into the grey water that separated Europe from the convoys it was trying to destroy. Each departure from Bergen was conducted with the same procedures, the same checks, the same final looks at the dock before the hatch closed and the boat slipped beneath the surface. The base watched them go with the detached efficiency of a place that had made this routine. It did not know, because it could not know, which of the boats pulling away from its quays would return, and which were already beginning the longest patrols of all, the ones that ended somewhere beneath the Atlantic, without ceremony, without record, without the brass band that played for the ones who came home. For a time, Bergen had felt like a place where the mathematics of war worked in Germany's favor. U-boats departed, found their targets, and returned. Tonnage sank, records were broken, and the officers who walked the quayside did so with the particular confidence of men who believed the sea was theirs. The workshops hummed with purpose, the fuel lines ran full, and the crews who rested between patrols could convince themselves that the rhythm of departure and return would continue indefinitely. The base had grown into something more than a military installation. It had become, in the minds of those who served there, proof that the strategy was working. But 1942 would begin to show them something they were not prepared to see. The ocean that had yielded so generously was learning to fight back. The shift did not arrive as a single shock. It came the way most military reversals do, gradually, and then with a terrible acceleration. The British and their American allies had spent the preceding years absorbing punishment, studying wreckage, and drawing conclusions from the patterns of their losses. They had watched the wolf packs operate, mapped the corridors through which U-boats moved, and sent scientists and engineers to work on problems that had once seemed insoluble. What emerged from those efforts was not a single weapon but a constellation of capabilities. Improvements in radar technology, refinements in sonar detection, new coordination methods between ships and aircraft, that, taken together, fundamentally altered the geometry of submarine warfare. The hunters who had moved with near impunity through the Atlantic were about to discover that the ocean had acquired eyes. Radar proved to be among the most consequential developments. Earlier versions had limitations that U-boat commanders had learned to exploit, but the newer centimetric equipment changed the calculation entirely. A submarine running on the surface at night, which had once been among the safest conditions for an approach, now found itself visible to aircraft and escort vessels at ranges that offered almost no time to dive. The darkness that had felt like cover became a liability. Crews could no longer trust the night to conceal them from an enemy who could now see without seeing. For the men operating out of Bergen, this meant that the early portions of a patrol, the long run from the Norwegian coast toward the Atlantic convoy routes, carried a new and disquieting uncertainty. What had once been a predictable transit was becoming a vulnerability in itself. The escort groups that protected Allied convoys were changing as well. In the earlier years, convoy protection had often been improvised. Too few ships, insufficiently trained crews, inadequate communications between escorts and aircraft overhead. By 1942, that picture had changed considerably. Dedicated escort groups began training together as cohesive units, developing shared doctrine, shared signals, and shared instincts for how to prosecute a contact. Where a U-boat commander had previously counted on breaking through a thin screen of defenders, he now faced something approaching a coordinated defensive system. The convoy, which had seemed like a herd moving slowly through a predator's territory, was evolving into a fortress in motion, one with teeth pointed outward in every direction. The crews at Bergen began to feel the consequences in the numbers that mattered most, the numbers of boats that did not come home. In the early period of the war, losses had existed, and no one pretended otherwise, but they had been absorbed into an overall picture of success that still seemed favorable. By the middle of 1942, the arithmetic was shifting. Return patrols brought back men who described contacts that had ended not in kills, but in hours-long depth charge ordeals. Boats battered, leaking, their machinery strained to its limits. Some brought back nothing, because there was no one left to bring back. The gaps at the quayside were quiet, but they were noticed. A berth that stayed empty longer than expected was a fact that everyone understood without discussing it. The base at Bergen developed a particular tension during this period, a tension between what was officially reported and what was privately understood. The machinery of naval administration continued to function. Dispatches went out and came in, and the language of those dispatches maintained the tone of an organization managing difficulties rather than facing a crisis. But the men who worked in the repair yards could see the condition of the boats that returned. They could count the damage marks, assess the stress fractures in pressure hulls, and make their own calculations about what the sea was doing to the fleet. The engineers who kept the base operational were not strategists, but they understood the difference between a machine being used hard and a machine being broken. Dönitz and his planning staff were not blind to the trend. They responded with adjustments, routing changes, new tactical instructions, alterations in operating depths and timing. The Wolfpack concept itself was re-examined, with efforts made to improve coordination and signals security. Bergen's role as a hub for crew rotations and repairs meant that these doctrinal adjustments flowed through the base constantly. New orders posted, briefings revised, junior officers absorbing updated procedures and passing them down to their crews. There was no shortage of institutional energy, no shortage of determination to find the answer that would restore the balance. What was becoming harder to sustain, quietly, was the certainty that the answer existed. Aircraft were a particular source of dread that grew through 1942. The Atlantic had never been fully covered by Allied air patrols, and that gap, the area beyond the reach of land-based aircraft, had been one of the Wolfpack's most reliable hunting grounds. But the coverage was expanding. Longer-range aircraft, improved coordination between coastal command patrols and convoy routing, and the gradual development of carrier-based support all worked to shrink the sanctuary. A U-boat captain who had learned to time his surface runs for the gaps in the patrol schedules was finding that those gaps were closing. The sky, like the sea surface at night, was becoming a hostile environment in ways it had not been at the start of the war. For the crews who rotated through Bergen's rest facilities between patrols, the base itself remained a place of relative comfort. Warm bunks, adequate food, the company of men who understood what the sea demanded. But the conversations in the mess halls were changing in tone. Veterans who had made multiple patrols described conditions that the newer men listened to carefully. The accumulation of testimony had its own weight. Not despair, the discipline of the submarine service held that at bay, at least for now, but a growing sobriety about what the next patrol might bring. Bergen had been built as a place of confidence, and confidence was not yet gone, but it was no longer the only thing in the room. The support infrastructure at the base adapted as best it could to increasing losses and returning damage. The repair workshops, which had always been busy, now faced queues of boats requiring work that went beyond routine maintenance. Pressure hulls, stressed by prolonged depth charging, required careful inspection and sometimes structural repair. Propulsion systems, periscopes, diving planes, the attrition of hard use and harder circumstances showed in every component. The workforce, German technicians alongside forced labourers from across occupied Europe, maintained a pace that left little room for rest. The fortress that had been built to project power was increasingly spending its energy on triage. What Bergen's commanders could not repair was the informational advantage the Allies were building. Intelligence work, code-breaking efforts, the careful analysis of intercepts and patrol reports. These invisible processes were shaping the tactical environment in ways that no concrete structure or additional fuel depot could address. Convoys that should have been in a certain position were sometimes not there. Patrol routes that had been productive became quiet. The ocean began to feel, in the accounts of returning commanders, as though it knew where they were going. That intuition, that the enemy could see what they were doing, was unsettling in ways that went beyond any single tactical defeat. By the end of 1942, Bergen had not yet become a place of defeat. The base still functioned, boats still departed, and the will to fight remained. But the quality of what was possible had changed, and the men who knew the base best, the commanders, the engineers, the experienced crew chiefs who had seen the early years, could sense it. The mathematics that had once seemed to favor them were now neutral at best. The harbor that had been a place of accumulating confidence was becoming something quieter, something more careful. A fortress still, yes, but a fortress that had begun to understand it could not guarantee the safety of the men it sent out. The sea had changed, and Bergen, concrete and iron and kilometers of reinforced bunker though it was, could not change that back. The year 1943 opened with a deception so complete that German naval planners refused to acknowledge it, even as the evidence accumulated in the harbors of occupied Norway. Bergen's U-boat crews had grown accustomed to a particular rhythm of warfare: long patrols into the Atlantic, occasional losses balanced by celebrated kills, and a sense that the tonnage war, as Admiral Dönitz called it, was a grinding contest that Germany could ultimately win through sheer attrition. The mathematics seemed simple enough: sink more Allied merchant ships than the Americans could build, choke off supplies to Britain, and force a negotiated peace. But in 1943, those mathematics underwent a violent and irreversible transformation. The change was not sudden in the way an explosion arrives without warning, but rather like watching the sun set and realizing only when darkness is nearly complete that day has surrendered to night. By the spring of 1943, U-boats departing Bergen encountered a dramatically altered Atlantic landscape. Where months earlier they had found scattered convoys defended by a handful of escorting warships, they now discovered organized walls of opposition: more destroyers, more corvettes, more aircraft than the most pessimistic calculations had predicted. The Allies had made a crucial decision to concentrate resources on convoy protection, and they had married this tactical insight with technological advances that caught the German submarine arm unprepared. Radar sets aboard escort vessels, improved sonar equipment, and most critically, long-range patrol aircraft operating from new bases in Iceland and Northern Ireland created a multi-layered defense system against which the U-boat's greatest advantage, the ability to strike unseen, counted for less with each passing month. Officers returning to Bergen brought reports that contradicted the triumphalist dispatches still being issued from Berlin. The tone of these reports was carefully controlled, filtered through military hierarchy and censorship. Yet those who listened closely could hear something new in the voices of returning commanders: a note of caution, occasionally of genuine alarm, and underneath it all, the dawning recognition that the enemy had adapted. The effect on Bergen's repair yards was immediate and catastrophic. Throughout 1942, the base had operated at what commanders considered peak efficiency. U-boats arrived damaged, underwent repairs ranging from routine to extensive, and departed once more for the Atlantic. The yards developed an almost surgical precision in this process, with crews working shifts to restore boats to combat readiness. But 1943 shattered this equilibrium. Submarines arrived not just damaged but savagely wounded, hulls rupturing from depth charges, torpedo tubes twisted beyond use, entire sections of superstructure torn away by near misses from aerial bombs. The damage control parties and welders worked longer hours under mounting pressure, their task no longer a matter of professional pride, but of desperate necessity. The repair capacity that had seemed adequate throughout 1942 suddenly became critically insufficient. Bergen's industrial plant, for all its concrete bunkers and specialized equipment, could rehabilitate perhaps a dozen boats simultaneously under ideal circumstances. But the flow of damaged U-boats arriving from the Atlantic soon exceeded this capacity by a factor that the base commander's staff could only describe in internal reports with phrases like operationally unsustainable and materially critical. The human cost of this reversal registered first in the faces of men. Crews returning from patrols in 1943 wore a different expression than their predecessors from earlier years. The submarine service had always been dangerous. The mortality rates for U-boat crews would eventually exceed those of any other branch of the German military. But there had existed a quality of acceptable risk, a sense that losses occurred within bounds that could be rationalized as necessary sacrifices in pursuit of strategic victory. By mid-1943, this calculus had collapsed. Men were disappearing now, with a regularity that made it almost impossible to maintain the psychological distance necessary for military discipline. A U-boat would depart Bergen with a crew of around 50 officers and men. Not all would return. Some boats would fail to report at all, their fates unknown, their crews simply gone. Others limped back with casualty lists that included names of men everyone in the base had known, men who ate in the same canteens, slept in the same barracks, and worked in the same repair shops. The psychological weight of this accumulation of losses began to manifest in ways that concerned the command structure. The repair yards themselves became a kind of mirror, reflecting Germany's broader strategic crisis. Engineers and welders worked with determination, but they also worked with materials that grew more difficult to obtain. Replacement parts that had once arrived regularly now came sporadically, delayed by the increasingly chaotic logistics systems struggling to supply the entire German war machine. Copper wiring became scarce. Specialized steel for hull repairs required requisitions that took weeks to process. Diesel fuel, essential for testing engines after repairs, was rationed. The work continued because it had to continue, because military discipline and professional pride compelled men to maintain standards despite deteriorating circumstances. But everyone involved understood they were increasingly fighting against material reality, rather than merely against enemy tactics. The base commander issued orders to maximize efficiency, to repair boats in parallel rather than serially, to establish triage systems that would prioritize submarines most capable of returning to operational service. These orders reflected sound military logic, yet they also represented an implicit acknowledgement that Bergen could no longer simultaneously accommodate all the U-boats that required its services. The shift in atmosphere permeated every level of the base with a quality that careful observers could measure in subtle changes. In 1942 and earlier 1943, the harbour had possessed an almost industrial buoyancy, the sense of a great machine functioning at the service of a larger purpose. Officers who had served in other German military installations often remarked on the unusual morale at Bergen, on the sense that crews believed genuinely in the righteousness and ultimate success of their cause. By the autumn of 1943, this had altered fundamentally. Men still performed their duties, and salutes remained sharp, Yet conversations conducted in off-duty moments revealed a different preoccupation. Officers discussed losses in conversations that, though carefully guarded, reflected genuine pessimism about the war's trajectory. Younger sailors, many of whom had enlisted in earlier years when German victory seemed assured, began writing letters home with phrases that suggested something closer to resignation than confidence. The command structure was aware of these shifts in mood. It issued disciplinary notices, rotated personnel to prevent clusters of malcontents from reinforcing each other's doubts, and maintained the organizational systems that kept the base functioning despite the psychological current running against its mission. Perhaps the most tangible manifestation of 1943's reversal appeared in the harbour itself. In the earlier years of the war, Bergen's submarine pens had been filled with boats preparing for operations or recovering from them, a constant cycle of activity. By mid-1943, observers noticed increasing periods when fewer boats occupied the pens simultaneously. This was not a consequence of some German strategic success or decision to redeploy resources, but rather the simple reality that fewer U-boats were returning to base. Some were sunk outright, lost to depth charges or torpedoes or mines, or the various other dangers that surrounded submarine operations in the increasingly hostile Atlantic. Others were damaged so severely that they required months of repair that the base's limited capacity could not provide on any reasonable timeline. Still others were simply lost to the fog of war, their final messages sending coordinates that grew increasingly incoherent until they ceased altogether. The statistical picture would not become fully clear until the war ended and tallies could be carefully compiled, but those living through the crisis understood intuitively that the calculus of the submarine war had shifted against Germany in a manner that no amount of tactical adjustment or technological improvement seemed capable of reversing. The tonnage war that had defined German naval strategy entered its catastrophic phase in 1943. Without dramatic fanfare or clear demarcation, there would be no moment when German Naval Command issued an official acknowledgement that the strategy had fundamentally failed. Instead, the realization arrived gradually, layered beneath official optimism and propagandistic announcements that continued to celebrate U-boat victories and exhort crews to greater efforts. But those actually stationed at Bergen, the officers studying patrol reports, the engineers calculating repair timelines, the sailors maintaining the boats and facilities, understood that something fundamental had broken. The confidence that had animated the U-boat arm in earlier years became increasingly difficult to sustain against evidence that accumulated daily. Each boat lost represented not merely a ship and crew, but a tremendous investment in construction, training, and resources that Germany could no longer easily replace. The Americans, by contrast, were building submarines at a rate that dwarfed German production, creating an asymmetry that had less to do with tactical brilliance on either side and more to do with the vast industrial advantages the Allied nations possessed. The irony that stalked Bergen throughout 1943 was that the fortress itself remained as formidable as ever. The concrete bunkers were impervious to anything except the heaviest bombing raids. The repair facilities represented some of the most advanced industrial capability the German military could offer. The supply lines, though increasingly stressed, still functioned to deliver the essential materials required to maintain a major military installation. Yet all of this capability proved unable to alter the fundamental situation facing the submarine arm. Bergen could fix boats, but it could not fix the strategic situation that made their losses multiply. It could maintain facilities, but it could not replace the crews whose expertise and experience could not be rapidly reconstructed once killed or captured. It could issue orders and maintain discipline, but it could not reverse the tide that was flowing against Germany with increasing force. As 1943 progressed toward its final months, Bergen's role in the war seemed increasingly to be one of managing decline rather than pursuing victory. U-boats continued to depart, still commanded by officers who maintained the formal protocols and battle orders issued from Berlin, still crewed by men who performed their duties with military discipline. But the underlying reality had shifted. The base that had been imagined as a final triumph of German military organization and engineering now stood as a monument to strategic miscalculation and the limits of tactical prowess when arrayed against superior material resources and coordinated strategic opposition. The repair yards would continue their work into 1944 and beyond, but the great tonnage war that had seemed capable of changing the course of the conflict had already entered its terminal decline. Bergen endured as a fortress, but fortresses, the history of warfare teaches, ultimately prove less relevant than the broader strategic circumstances in which they operate. The year 1943 had provided the painful lesson that even the most impressive military installation cannot compensate for a strategy that has fundamentally failed to account for the enemy's capacity to adapt, improvise, and ultimately overwhelm through superior capability and will. By 1943, the Bergen U-boat base had become something more than a military installation. It was a statement in concrete and steel, a monument to German ambition rising from the Norwegian coast. The fortress seemed to declare an immutable fact. Here, in these waters, German power would endure. The bunkers were thick enough to withstand anything. The repair facilities were positioned deep inland, away from casual observation. The anti-aircraft batteries ringed the harbour like teeth. From the perspective of those who built it, Bergen was impregnable. But impenetrability, the Allies understood, was a matter of perspective, and they were beginning to acquire a rather different one. The Royal Air Force had been watching Bergen since 1940, tracking the transformation of the harbour from a merchant port into something far more dangerous. Photographic reconnaissance flights brought back images of concrete construction sites, of U-boats nestled in their pens, of repair yards operating around the clock. The photographs told a story of German strategic commitment. They also told the story of a target. By 1943, Bergen had risen to the top of the RAF's priority list. The base was not merely a facility, it was a bottleneck through which the entire Atlantic U-boat campaign flowed. Strike it hard enough, and the toll on German submarines might be measurable. Strike it in the right places, and the consequences might alter the balance of the entire naval war. The first serious bombing raid came in the spring of 1943, and it announced that the era of Bergen's isolation from the air war was over. Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers, flying from British airfields hundreds of kilometres away, approached the Norwegian coast in formation. The Lancasters were among the most capable bombers in the world, fast, heavily armed, and capable of carrying a destructive payload that bore no relation to their size. The German defenders, confident in their bunkers and their anti-aircraft batteries, prepared to meet the threat. The harbour erupted in flak and noise. Searchlight beams swept across the night sky. But the Lancasters were flown by crews trained in precision bombing, and they knew what they were looking for. Bombs fell on the repair facilities. Explosions cascaded through the docks. Fire spread across the harbour in sheets of orange and yellow light. The aftermath was sobering for the German garrison. The raid had killed workers and soldiers. It had damaged fuel storage facilities. More troubling, It had shattered the psychological certainty that the fortress was truly a fortress. Concrete bunkers could withstand a great many things, but they could not prevent bombs from reaching targets outside their protection. The repair yards, the fuel depots, the crane systems and loading facilities, these were essential to the base's function, yet they were vulnerable. German engineers surveyed the damage and understood an unpleasant truth. A fortress was only as strong as its least protected component, and Bergen had many components that could not be protected, at least not completely. Through the summer and into the autumn of 1943, the Royal Air Force returned again and again. The raids grew more coordinated, more frequent, and more devastating. The Lancasters were joined by other bombers, Halifaxes, Manchester aircraft, and eventually American B-17 flying fortresses. The tempo of the offensive accelerated. Sometimes the raids came during daylight hours, the bombers visible against the sky as they approached. Sometimes they came at night, the attackers invisible until explosions illuminated the darkness. The German defenders adjusted their tactics, relocating anti-aircraft batteries, camouflaging facilities, organizing round-the-clock watches. But adjustments could only do so much against an enemy that possessed both the technology and the will to keep striking. Each raid imposed a cost that was measured not in abstract terms, but in lives. The repair yards of Bergen employed thousands of workers, German naval personnel, conscripted civilians, and forced laborers from across occupied Europe. When bombs fell on the yards, they fell on human beings. The barracks where workers lived were not particularly substantial structures. The mess halls where they ate were not hardened installations. A bomb that missed the bunker might strike a work crew or a supply building. A near miss could kill by blast alone. The accumulated toll of the raids, 100 casualties in one attack, 200 in another, the numbers never stopping, began to weigh on the morale of the garrison. Men who had endured years of war suddenly found themselves in a shooting gallery where the other side controlled the skies entirely. The strategic impact of the raids extended beyond the immediate destruction they caused. Each bombing attack required German resources to respond. Anti-aircraft ammunition had to be manufactured and transported. Repair crews had to work longer shifts to restore damaged facilities. Personnel had to be rotated in and out of Bergen to replace casualties and maintain security. The base, which had been designed to project power outward against Allied shipping, now found itself forced into a defensive posture. Resources that might have gone toward improving U-boat capabilities or expanding repair capacity instead went toward defending against air attack. The fortress was becoming expensive to maintain, precisely because it was proving to be vulnerable. By 1944, the bombing campaign against Bergen had matured into something systematic and relentless. The RAF had accumulated detailed intelligence about the base's layout, its weak points, and the optimal methods for striking it. Bombing runs were planned with precision. Pathfinder aircraft equipped with radar and other navigational aids would precede the main bomber streams, identifying targets and marking them with flares. The main force would then follow, dropping their bombs with considerable accuracy even through cloud cover. The German defenders, despite their courage and their dedication, simply did not have the tools to prevent this. Anti-aircraft batteries could shoot down some bombers, but not enough. Fighter aircraft scrambled from nearby bases might achieve a few kills, but the bomber streams were large and their escorts were formidable. The mathematics of the aerial war were moving decisively against Germany. The fortress bunkers, which had seemed like permanent structures when they were completed, began to acquire a different character. They became shelters, places of refuge rather than monuments to power. When air raid sirens sounded across the harbor, and they sounded with increasing frequency, personnel would abandon their work and hurry toward the nearest bunker. The men would crowd together in the darkness underground, listening to the sound of explosions above, feeling the concrete walls vibrate with each impact, and wondering if this might be the raid that found them. The psychological toll of this cycle: work, alarm, shelter, return, repair, work again, ground away at morale in ways that no amount of Nazi ideology could countermand. The damage pattern that emerged from the repeated raids revealed something important about the limitations of fortress engineering. The bunkers themselves, the core of the installation, proved notably durable. A bomb might crater the earth around them or destroy structures nearby, but penetrating a thick concrete bunker designed specifically to withstand bombardment required either extraordinary luck or a bomb of exceptional size. But the bunkers could not protect everything. The approaches to the bunkers could be damaged. The roads leading to them could be cratered. The fuel lines connecting to them could be ruptured. The cranes and loading equipment that served them could be obliterated. Gradually, through hundreds of tons of bombs, the operational network that connected the fortress components to each other was being degraded. The base could survive as a structure even as it failed as a functional military installation. By late 1944, the reality was becoming unavoidable, even to those who hoped against reason. The Royal Air Force had established an absolute dominance of the air over Bergen and the surrounding region. German fighter squadrons had been depleted to near nothing by losses in other theaters. Anti-aircraft batteries, though numerous, lacked sufficient ammunition for sustained defense. The bombers came and went almost at will. The raids killed people. They disrupted operations. They destroyed facilities and made repairs increasingly difficult to execute. And they were relentless. Not occasional harassment, but systematic crushing pressure applied day after day, week after week. The fortress that had seemed so formidable, so permanent, so capable of enduring anything that the war might bring, had proven vulnerable to a threat that its designers had not fully anticipated. The bunkers could withstand bombs, but Germany could not withstand the bomber streams. The base could be rebuilt after each raid, but Germany could not replace the industrial capacity that was being consumed in defending it. The workers and soldiers who died in the attacks could be replaced by drafting new personnel, but each replacement was a fresh loss to German manpower. Bergen remained a fortress, but it was a fortress under siege, not by an army approaching across land, but by an enemy that controlled the sky and could strike without warning whenever weather permitted. The vulnerability from above was slowly, inexorably, grinding the base into something less than what it had been. Still a military installation, still dangerous in its way, but increasingly a burden rather than an asset to the broader war effort. By the time 1945 arrived, the air raids had become so constant that they were simply part of the world of Bergen. New explosions did not particularly surprise anyone anymore. The base commander and his staff had adapted their thinking to assume that any structure above ground could be destroyed, that operations would be interrupted regularly, that personnel would suffer casualties. The bombing campaign had not destroyed the fortress. The bunkers remained. But it had destroyed something equally important: the certainty that the fortress mattered. Men who had served there for years understood, without needing to be told, that Germany was not going to win. The air above Bergen belonged entirely to the enemy. The waters around it would soon belong to the enemy as well. The fortress, for all its concrete and steel, could not change facts that had already been decided in places far from the Norwegian coast. In the winter of 1943, Bergen's fortress seemed secure in ways that transcended mere concrete and steel. The base had weathered months of intensifying air attacks. Its bunkers had absorbed countless bombs. Its repair facilities had restored damaged U-boats to fighting condition with mechanical precision. Yet in December of that year, an event nearly 800 kilometers distant would ripple through the base with consequences that no bomb could have achieved. The heavy cruiser Scharnhorst, a vessel that embodied German naval ambition and had operated intermittently from Bergen's harbour, would be sunk in the Arctic waters near North Cape. Her loss would expose a truth that German command could no longer ignore. Even the most powerful surface warships could not guarantee security against a determined and coordinated enemy. Bergen's strategic importance, already weakening, would be called into question at the highest levels of the German naval establishment. The fortress would begin its slow transformation from a place of confidence into a repository of doubt. The Scharnhorst had served as a symbol of German naval capability throughout the war. She was a battle cruiser of considerable tonnage and firepower, equipped with heavy guns and armor plating that made her formidable in conventional naval engagements. Since the invasion of Norway, she had operated sporadically from Norwegian ports, including Bergen itself, as German command sought to use her presence to deter Allied operations in the Norwegian Sea and to threaten convoys supplying the Soviet Union. Her very existence in Scandinavian waters created strategic complications for Allied planners. The Royal Navy had to account for her capabilities and potential movements. For the German naval staff, the Scharnhorst represented a piece on the strategic board that could still influence events, still demand respect from enemies who possessed numerical superiority. Yet this image of strength masked a deteriorating reality. The ship's movements had become increasingly constrained by fuel shortages, maintenance requirements, and the growing dominance of Allied air power. Bergen had become one of her regular havens, a place where she could rest between operations and undergo repairs that her worn hull increasingly required. By late 1943, the German Naval High Command faced a dilemma regarding the Scharnhorst's role. Keeping her in Norwegian waters tied up an enormous amount of resources and attention, but offered diminishing strategic returns. The Allies had learned to hunt German surface ships with ruthless efficiency. The Bismarck's destruction 3 years earlier remained seared into the consciousness of every German officer. Yet leaving the Scharnhorst idle in port seemed wasteful when other German interests might require her presence. In November and December of 1943, the ship received orders for operations against a British convoy designated JW55B, a supply mission bound for the Soviet Union via the Barents Sea. The operation seemed conventional enough: intercept the convoy, inflict damage, and withdraw. German intelligence suggested that Allied escort forces would be limited and that the Scharnhorst's superior firepower would provide decisive advantage. Command issued the order. The ship prepared to sortie from Norwegian waters. No one in the planning stages anticipated the catastrophe that awaited. On the 26th of December 1943, the Scharnhorst departed her position to intercept the convoy. The Arctic weather was brutal. Darkness persisted through most of the day, temperatures plummeted, and visibility was limited. Aboard the ship, officers and crew understood the mission's importance. A successful attack on the convoy would demonstrate that German naval power could still strike significant blows. Failure would confirm what many already suspected, that Germany's days as a naval power were ending. The ship steamed northward through waters that had become increasingly dangerous. British naval forces, including the battleship Duke of York and escorting cruisers and destroyers, had been positioned to provide convoy protection. The encounter that followed was brief but decisive. The Scharnhorst, despite her firepower and armor, found herself facing overwhelming opposition. She was struck repeatedly by shells and torpedoes. Her engines were damaged, her hull was breached. Within hours, the ship that had seemed so formidable sank beneath the Arctic waves, taking most of her crew with her. The loss of the Scharnhorst reached Bergen within hours, carried by signals, traffic, and radio reports that officers throughout the base could hear. At first, some refused to believe it. A ship of that size, that firepower, that prestige, did not simply vanish. Surely there was error in the reports. Surely she had been damaged but was limping toward safety. Yet as confirmations arrived, the reality became impossible to deny. The Scharnhorst was gone. Her crew was gone. One of the two major surface warships that Germany still possessed had been destroyed. The shock that rippled through Bergen was not merely operational or strategic, it was psychological. The base had been constructed partly to support and protect German surface warships as they operated in northern waters. The fortress had been justified partly by the presence of such vessels. Now one of them had been destroyed despite the proximity of the base, despite all the defenses and preparations, despite all the assurances that German naval power could still contest Allied dominance in these waters. The implications unfolded slowly through the days following the sinking. At Bergen, officers gathered to discuss what the loss meant. Some argued that the operation had been poorly planned, that intelligence about Allied escort strength had been fatally flawed, that the Scharnhorst should never have been sent into waters where the Allies possessed overwhelming naval force. Others contended that the loss was inevitable, that in a war where Germany faced enemies with vastly superior industrial capacity and access to global resources, even the most powerful individual ships would eventually be hunted down and destroyed. The arguments were accurate, but beside the point. What mattered was that a major German warship, one that had carried the nation's naval prestige and capabilities, had been sunk by coordinated enemy action. The Bergen fortress, magnificent though it was, had not prevented this outcome. The bunkers and repair facilities had not saved the Scharnhorst. The fortress had not deterred the Allies from committing capital ships to operations in Norwegian waters. The base's strategic rationale, to support German naval power in the north, had not prevented the destruction of that power. In the higher echelons of German command, questions about Norway's naval strategy intensified. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, and others in the military establishment began questioning whether maintaining such a garrison in Bergen was justifiable. The base consumed enormous resources: fuel, steel, ammunition, construction materials, and manpower. It required constant defense against air attack. It tied up naval personnel who might be deployed elsewhere. Yet the rationale for its existence, to support an active and threatening German naval presence in Norwegian waters, had become increasingly tenuous. The U-boats operating from Bergen remained significant, but they were being hunted with increasing success by Allied anti-submarine forces. The large surface warships that the base was partly designed to support had been eliminated or were hiding in port, afraid to emerge. The fortress was becoming a monument to a strategic vision that was dying. German command could not yet articulate the thought directly, could not yet admit that perhaps Norway might be abandoned, but the Scharnhorst's sinking had planted the seed of doubt in minds that had previously accepted Bergen's importance as axiomatic. For the men stationed at Bergen, the Scharnhorst's loss carried different significance. Some had known crew members aboard the ship. The base's social and professional circles were sufficiently small that the death of hundreds of sailors was not abstract, it was personal. It was the loss of men they had served alongside, men they had shared meals with, men they had expected to see return from this operation. The sinking also crystallized something that junior officers and enlisted men had been sensing for months. The war was not going to end in German victory. A modern, well-armed, carefully defended fortress could not guarantee that ships operating from its protection would return. The Allies could strike German vessels anywhere, could coordinate forces across vast distances, could bring overwhelming force to bear. In Bergen's bars and barracks, conversations became quieter. The talk of wonder weapons and technological breakthroughs continued, but it carried less conviction. The talk of holding until the enemy tired or offered peace terms became increasingly strained. The Scharnhorst lay at the bottom of the Arctic Sea, and her loss had changed something fundamental in how the men at Bergen understood their position. The immediate operational response at Bergen was to increase defences and security measures. German command, sensitive to the blow the Scharnhorst's loss represented, authorized additional resources for the base. Anti-aircraft batteries were expanded. Defensive positions were strengthened. Yet these measures addressed the symptoms rather than the disease. The fundamental vulnerability of the base, that it could be threatened by enemies who controlled the sea and the air, remained unchanged. Air raids intensified through the early months of 1944. The Royal Air Force, emboldened by the progress of the war and the recognition that Bergen remained a significant German installation, launched strikes aimed at the bunkers and repair facilities. The fortress took damage. Workers died. Facilities were disrupted. The very measures designed to make Bergen impregnable showed their limitations when enemies possessed air superiority and the industrial capacity to sustain bombing campaigns indefinitely. The Scharnhorst crisis also affected the morale and decision-making of Bergen's commander and senior officers. These men had accepted that they were building and maintaining a fortress that would prove vital to German victory. They had accepted the hardships of service in the Arctic, the dangers of air raids, the constant state of alert. The loss of the Scharnhorst suggested that perhaps these sacrifices were being made in service of illusions. The ship had been lost despite every advantage Germany could provide it. She had been lost despite being a modern, well-constructed, heavily armed warship. She had been lost because the Allies possessed superior force and the means to project it across vast distances. If the Scharnhorst could be lost, what fate awaited a fixed installation like Bergen's fortress? What protection could concrete and steel offer if enemies could approach from the air, could coordinate naval forces, could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on any point they chose? These questions were never spoken aloud in official settings. Discipline and chains of command remained intact, but they shaped how decisions were made. Requests for additional resources were made with slightly less confidence. Planning for future operations proceeded with slightly more awareness of limitations. The fortress remained formidable, but it was now a fortress under a gathering shadow. In the broader context of the war, the Scharnhorst's sinking marked the end of Germany's capacity to contest control of northern waters with major surface warships. The Bismarck had been destroyed in 1941. The Scharnhorst was gone. The Tirpitz, the other major German warship, would spend the final year of the war hidden in a Norwegian fjord, essentially a prisoner. Germany's naval war would be conducted henceforth by U-boats and smaller vessels. Bergen would continue to serve as a U-boat base, but its role as a fortress protecting German surface naval power was at an end. The fortress itself would remain impressive, but it was now a fortress protecting nothing but the memory of German naval ambition. Bergen's garrison, observing from their fortress in December 1943, understood that something had shifted. The Scharnhorst had represented a link to an earlier phase of the war, when German naval power, though stretched, had still possessed strategic options. Her destruction severed that link. The base would continue operations, would endure further bombing, would maintain discipline and readiness. But the sense of forward motion, the belief that German forces were conducting an active campaign that might yet influence the war's outcome, had begun its slow erosion. The fortress had been built to support German victory. The loss of the Scharnhorst suggested that victory was no longer a matter of when, but whether German forces would ever achieve it. In Bergen's concrete bunkers and steel repair shops, that quiet recognition began to take hold. The fortress remained, but the conviction that sustained it was beginning to falter. By 1944, the men at Bergen understood a truth that High Command refused to speak aloud. The conventional U-boat had become a liability. The Atlantic Wolfpack tactics that had brought such devastating success in the early war years belonged to a different era, one where submarines hunted on the surface under cover of darkness and radar remained an Allied novelty. Now radar had matured into something far more sinister, an invisible eye that could find a surfaced U-boat in seconds. Sonar arrays, deployed from escort vessels in coordinated patterns, transformed the ocean itself into a medium that exposed rather than concealed. The U-boat force was hemorrhaging boats faster than shipyards could replace them. Admiral Dönitz himself, once confident in his fleet's eventual triumph, now spoke in whispers of new technologies that might yet reverse the catastrophic losses. Bergen, with its engineering facilities and its privileged position within the Nazi naval hierarchy, became ground zero for a desperate technological gamble. If salvation existed, it would arrive here first, in the form of machines that defied the Allied advantages that had strangled the conventional U-boat arm. The Type 21 represented the embodiment of that desperate hope. This was not a refinement of existing designs, but a radical departure from everything that had come before. Where previous U-boats had been fundamentally surface vessels that could submerge, the Type 21 was designed to be a true underwater warship. Its hydrodynamic hull shape, borrowed from research stations and theoretical calculations, would allow speeds underwater that matched or exceeded the surface speeds of older boats. More critically, it could remain submerged for extended periods while operating its diesel engines through a revolutionary snorkel system that would allow it to breathe without exposing itself to air. Engineers at Bergen studied blueprints and discussed specifications with an intensity born from understanding that this single design might represent the final throw of the dice. The boat's superior underwater maneuverability meant it could dive deeper, turn sharper, and maintain speed in ways that would confound the predictive algorithms that Allied anti-submarine teams had refined over 3 years of hunting. Some men whispered that the Type 21 might actually win back the Atlantic. Others, more realistic, understood it might at least restore dignity to the final months of a war that was already lost. But submarines alone could not overcome the fundamental imbalance that had emerged by late 1944. A faster U-boat meant nothing if enemy destroyers could hear it approaching through layers of water. A more maneuverable boat provided marginal advantage if escort vessels could track its position and coordinate attacks from multiple directions. This realization drove German weapon designers toward a different solution, one that spoke to the shifting nature of naval warfare. The acoustic torpedo, codenamed the Gnat, represented an attempt to shift advantage back toward the submarine. Where conventional torpedoes required either direct visual targeting or blind firing into an estimated area, the Gnat could hear its prey. Acoustic sensors mounted in the torpedo's nose would track the sound signature of a target ship's propellers, homing in on the noise with single-minded determination. Once launched, the weapon needed no further guidance. It would follow the sound to its conclusion. Bergen's test facilities became laboratories for refining this acoustic technology, with engineers and weapons specialists working in secure bunkers to perfect systems that might allow a single U-boat to strike multiple targets in a convoy, even if the submarine itself remained undiscovered. The technical challenges were formidable. Acoustic sensors needed sufficient sensitivity to detect target ships at meaningful distances, but not so much sensitivity that they locked onto background noise. The torpedo's speed and depth had to be calibrated to match the characteristics of vessels in a typical convoy. If the gnat was too fast, it would overshoot targets before its acoustic seeker could acquire them. Too slow, and escort vessels would have time to maneuver and evade. Bergen's engineering teams conducted countless tests, launching experimental torpedoes in controlled sections of the harbor where results could be measured and analyzed. They studied acoustic data collected from British and American warships. They examined the propeller signatures of different vessel classes. They worked with an intensity that obscured the growing understanding among the technical specialists that innovation, however brilliant, arrives too late when the industrial capacity to produce it at scale no longer exists. A single Type 21 took months to complete. Gnat torpedo production could barely keep pace with demand for a handful of experimental units. By the time these weapons entered service, the U-boat fleet that might wield them effectively had already been shattered. The psychological dimension of this technological investment cannot be understated. For crews at Bergen, the arrival of new designs and new weapons provided something nearly as valuable as actual military advantage. They provided hope. Men who had watched comrades depart on patrols from which they would never return could believe that the next generation of boats might break the cycle. Officers who had witnessed the deteriorating circumstances of each successive patrol could cling to the notion that somewhere in these engineering facilities, salvation was taking shape. The base itself became a symbol of German refusal to surrender to the impossible. While other fronts crumbled and other commands faced the certainty of defeat, Bergen continued to innovate, to test, to push forward with the conviction that sufficient ingenuity might yet overturn the mathematics of industrial capacity and strategic position that had aligned so thoroughly against them. This was not mere delusion. The Type 21 and the Gnat represented genuine innovations that, had they been available in sufficient numbers 3 years earlier, might have altered the tactical equation. The tragedy lay in the timing. The technologies arrived when the war's outcome was already determined by larger forces that innovation could no longer influence. The working conditions within Bergen's technological divisions reflected the elevated status of this work. While other sections of the base faced increasing food shortages and uncertain supply lines, the engineering teams received priority allocation of resources. Scientists and engineers who might have been conscripted into combat roles were exempted and concentrated at Bergen. Civilian technicians from German research institutions were transferred to the base. Some came willingly, understanding that this represented significant work. Others arrived as conscripted specialists with no choice in the matter. Security around the Type 21 program and acoustic weapon development was extraordinary, even by military standards. Entire sections of the base were sealed off from the rest of the installation. No one outside the immediate project teams could observe the work or access the blueprints. This compartmentalization served legitimate security purposes, but also reflected a peculiar aspect of late-war German command structure, a willingness to invest enormous resources in isolated projects without clear strategic justification. The testing protocols developed at Bergen operated according to timelines that grew increasingly compressed. Where proper weapons development under normal circumstances might span years, Bergen's engineers worked under the assumption that every month of delay meant additional Allied advances in counter-submarine technology. Prototype Type 21 submarines were constructed and trials conducted with something approaching desperation. The boats demonstrated their theoretical advantages with sufficient regularity that the project continued to receive support and resources even as the larger war situation deteriorated catastrophically. Some trials succeeded dramatically, with the experimental submarines outrunning escort vessels and executing maneuvers that would have been impossible for older designs. Other tests ended in mechanical failures or design complications that required months of remediation. The accumulated effect was a facility operating at maximum intensity, while the rest of the German war machine wound down, a place where men worked 14-hour days perfecting weapons systems for a conflict that was already decided in the broader theatres of Europe. The human cost of Bergen's technological acceleration rarely appears in official records, but it shaped the atmosphere within the base. Exhaustion became endemic among the engineering staff. Accidents during test procedures claimed lives. Medical personnel struggled to treat injuries from equipment malfunctions and infrastructure failures. The sustained pressure to deliver results was tolerated by some and destroyed others. A few individuals achieved a kind of equilibrium with the demands placed upon them, finding professional satisfaction in solving technical problems that had no simple solutions. More experienced erosion of their humanity under the weight of ceaseless work in service of a cause that increasingly seemed hopeless. Psychological breakdowns occurred with sufficient frequency that command established protocols for quietly removing individuals deemed unable to continue. The irony was palpable to anyone with the perspective to recognize it. Men were destroying themselves physically and mentally to perfect weapons that would never be produced in quantities sufficient to matter for a war that was already lost. Bergen's role as testing ground for new technologies also meant that the base became something of an anomaly within German military structure by late 1944. While most installations faced declining resources and increasing chaos, Bergen continued to receive priority support. New equipment arrived. Personnel transfers brought specialists from across the Reich. The base's commander reported directly to High Naval Command and operated with a degree of autonomy that was unusual. This status created tension with other elements of the base that did not benefit from the technological project's priority allocation. Traditional submarine maintenance and repair work continued, but with fewer resources allocated than before. U-boats that returned from patrols damaged and in need of extensive repairs sometimes faced delays in being restored to service because engineering capacity was devoted to prototype development. The strain between the conventional and experimental functions of the base grew more pronounced as 1944 progressed. The Type 21 submarines that were constructed at Bergen or underwent trials there represented something genuinely revolutionary, yet their service record reflected the tragedy of their arrival. By the time the first boats entered operational service, the U-boat fleet as a coherent force had essentially ceased to exist as a meaningful offensive weapon. What few Type 21 boats deployed on patrol encountered an ocean environment that had transformed completely compared to the conditions under which earlier designs had operated. Allied forces possessed acoustic countermeasures specifically developed to neutralize the Nat torpedoes' homing systems. Escort vessel tactics had evolved to deal with submarines that could maneuver with greater agility. The boats were no longer operating within wolf pack formations, but rather in isolation, hoping to achieve results through stealth rather than coordinated numbers. The advantage that the Type 21 represented was real, but it competed against an opponent that had spent years developing responses to every U-boat innovation. Bergen's engineers had designed a solution to a problem that had already been superseded by larger strategic realities. The acoustic torpedo program faced similar complications. The handful of Nat torpedoes that were manufactured and deployed achieved some success, sinking vessels that would otherwise have escaped U-boat attacks. Yet the supply was never sufficient to arm more than a tiny fraction of the boats that remained operational. Production facilities could not scale to meaningful levels. The raw materials required were increasingly scarce as Allied bombing and naval action disrupted German supply lines. More fundamentally, once a single Nat was captured intact by Allied forces, the weapon's tactical advantage evaporated. Engineers could develop countermeasures. Tactical doctrine could adapt. The acoustic torpedo went from being a potential war changer to being merely one more capability that the U-boat fleet could employ in its final, desperate months of operation. Bergen's investment in the weapon's development continued regardless, driven by momentum and by the human tendency to complete work once begun, even when the objective for which it was begun no longer existed. The presence of these cutting-edge technological projects at Bergen created a peculiar atmosphere within the base as 1944 transitioned into 1945. Elsewhere, German military installations faced the accelerating reality of defeat. Commanders prepared defensive positions or made preparations for evacuation. Morale collapsed as the imminence of surrender became undeniable. Yet at Bergen, the technological programs continued with almost surreal detachment from the larger context. Engineers working on Type 21 modifications discussed hydrodynamic improvements as if the war would continue indefinitely. Scientists refining acoustic torpedo guidance systems conducted their work with academic precision. The base commander incorporated these programs into defensive plans for the installation, discussing how the new submarines might be employed in some theoretical final phase of the war. This compartmentalization allowed people within the technological divisions to sustain psychological continuity with the past, to believe they were engaged in work that mattered, even as the structures supporting that work crumbled around them. In the final accounting, Bergen's role as a testing ground for desperate innovations stands as testimony to both the ingenuity and the blindness of late-war Germany. The Type 21 submarine and the Nat torpedo represented genuine technological achievement. They were designed by brilliant engineers working with limited resources. Some aspects of their design remain influential in submarine development into the present era. Yet they also represented a fundamental misreading of the nature of the conflict. Technology might win tactical encounters, but it cannot reverse strategic collapse. A better U-boat might sink an additional merchant vessel or two, but it cannot restore an absent industrial capacity or revive a vanished fleet. Bergen poured resources into these systems even as the material capacity to manufacture them in meaningful quantities withered away. The base's technological aspirations became increasingly detached from the operational realities that surrounded them, a fortress of engineering excellence rising within a larger edifice that was crumbling into irrelevance. The year 1944 opened with a terrible clarity for those who commanded Germany's military machine. The fortress at Bergen, once a symbol of German naval dominance and strategic vision, now existed in a fundamentally altered world. The threats that surrounded this installation no longer came from a single direction or a single enemy. Instead, they converged from east, west, north, and from the skies above. The The base commander stood atop the concrete fortifications, watching the Norwegian winter landscape, aware that the walls built to project German power now enclosed a garrison facing encirclement not by foreign armies, but by the collapsing architecture of German strategic advantage itself. In the east, Soviet forces pressed westward with relentless momentum. The great offensives that had characterized the Eastern Front throughout 1943 had shattered German armies and pushed the front lines steadily backward. By the beginning of 1944, Moscow's armies advanced toward Poland and the Baltic regions. The psychological impact on Bergen's command cannot be overstated. Officers who had grown accustomed to thinking of Germany's war in Atlantic and Mediterranean terms now faced the reality that the Soviet Union advanced closer to Scandinavia with each passing month. The fortress commander received updated intelligence briefings that mapped Soviet positions, and each new map showed the threat growing more proximate, more undeniable, more urgent. The possibility of Soviet amphibious assault against Norwegian territory, while never materializing as a genuine operational threat, haunted German military planning. Strategic documents from this period revealed genuine concern about coordinated attacks from Soviet forces advancing through Finland or across the Barents Sea. Bergen, with its deep harbor and strategic importance, featured prominently in these nightmare scenarios. The base's defenses, designed to repel British and Norwegian attacks, suddenly required reimagining to account for Soviet threats. Reinforcements were demanded, new defensive positions were ordered constructed, and gun placements were repositioned. Yet the resources to accomplish these tasks proved increasingly elusive. The Soviet advance created a psychological pressure that mounted with each passing week, a distant drumbeat of approaching catastrophe. The Western threat proved far more immediate and terrifying. Throughout 1944, German commanders throughout occupied Europe confronted the growing certainty of Allied invasion. Planning staffs analyzed coastlines and calculated invasion probabilities. For Bergen, this meant recognition that British and Norwegian forces might assault the Norwegian coast, possibly targeting the base itself as a primary objective. The facility's value to the Allies as a strategic prize was undeniable. Capturing Bergen intact would yield enormous intelligence material, valuable installations, and eliminate a persistent threat to Allied naval operations. German commanders therefore implemented increasingly stringent defensive preparations. Anti-tank obstacles appeared on the approaches to the base. Gun emplacements multiplied. Fortified positions were strengthened with additional concrete and steel. Yet these defensive improvements came at a cost that the base could scarcely afford. Resources flowed toward military preparation that had been previously allocated to operational requirements. The submarine arm that had once received priority for everything from spare parts to food rations now competed with infantry and coastal defense forces for finite supplies. U-boat crews noticed the shift in priorities. The repair facilities that had operated at peak capacity now shared diesel fuel with generator plants powering defensive installations. The workshops that had bustled with mechanics fabricating replacement components now devoted manpower to constructing coastal defense positions. The transition from an offensive naval base to a defensive fortress consumed resources without producing the strategic results such massive investments might have once delivered. Air superiority belonged entirely to the Allies by the spring of 1944, and this fact reshaped every aspect of life and operations at Bergen. The Luftwaffe, once capable of disputing control of Norwegian skies, had been ground down across years of attritional warfare. By 1944, German fighter aircraft rarely appeared above the base. When they did, their presence lasted moments before superior Allied numbers forced them to withdraw or be destroyed. The Royal Air Force and the American Army Air Forces conducted bombing operations against the base with increasing frequency and growing confidence. These raids damaged facilities, killed workers, and created a constant atmosphere of danger that permeated daily existence. Anti-aircraft defenses ringed the base, but their operators knew these guns could rarely score decisive hits against coordinated bomber formations conducting attacks from high altitude. The strategic irrelevance that began creeping into Bergen's operations during 1944 became impossible to ignore by summer. U-boats sortied from the base with decreasing frequency, and the operational results of these patrols declined precipitously. The Atlantic campaign that had once generated excitement and celebration now produced mounting casualty lists. Crews departed on patrol knowing that the odds against their return had shifted dramatically compared to earlier years. The base commander received operational directives from higher command that seemed increasingly divorced from military reality. Orders to maintain readiness for offensive operations contrasted starkly with the visible deterioration of German naval power and the diminishing number of U-boats available for deployment. The commander himself occupied an increasingly impossible position within the German military hierarchy. He was responsible for maintaining the fortress in a state of readiness, yet he could not command the resources necessary to accomplish this task adequately. He was expected to execute operational orders, yet the operational environment had fundamentally changed. He was supposed to maintain security and morale within the base, yet every rational observer understood that Germany was losing the war. The gap between what he was ordered to accomplish and what was actually achievable widened with each passing week. This contradiction created stress that affected not just the commander, but rippled through the entire officer corps and enlisted personnel of the installation. Communication with higher command became increasingly surreal. Messages arrived that alternated between expressions of confidence in ultimate German victory and urgent requests for detailed defensive preparations suggesting the opposite. Staff meetings debated strategic scenarios that had become fundamentally disconnected from military reality. Planning documents were drafted and redrafted, each version attempting to reconcile the irreconcilable, the necessity of defending a position while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that this position could not be held. Some officers engaged in this planning with genuine conviction that German science or military innovation might yet restore the situation. Others performed these tasks mechanically, understanding that they were participating in elaborate theatre designed to maintain the appearance of control and purpose. The fortress itself, viewed from a purely material perspective, remained formidable. The concrete bunkers still bristled with weapons. The repair facilities still contained valuable machinery. The fuel depots still held supplies. The defensive positions still dominated the approaches to the harbour. Yet the fortress increasingly resembled a magnificent stage set for a drama that was already concluded. The audience had departed. The final act had been written and could not be rewritten. The actors continued to perform their roles with decreasing conviction that the performance served any purpose. U-boat crews returning from patrol found a base that seemed suspended in an impossible liminal space between war and surrender, between aggressive action and grim defense. By autumn of 1944, the situation had deteriorated further. Soviet forces had captured Finland's territory and now threatened Norwegian border regions. The question was no longer if the Allies would invade, but when and where they would strike. The strategic environment had transformed completely from the situation that had existed just 12 months prior. In 1943, Bergen had remained a base from which offensive operations could be mounted with hope of success. In 1944, it had become an installation that required defending against multiple simultaneous threats. The transformation was not gradual or subtle. It was absolute and undeniable. Officers understood it. Enlisted personnel understood it. Even the radio broadcasts and propaganda material distributed at the base could not fully obscure it. The psychological impact on the base's personnel manifested in subtle but pervasive ways. Discipline remained tight. Orders continued to be executed. Security protocols persisted. Yet morale fractured quietly beneath the surface. Conversations in off-duty moments turned to questions about the war's outcome and what might happen to those who served in Norway when the war concluded. Some men clung to hopes in German wonder weapons or strategic reversals that seemed increasingly implausible with each new intelligence report. Others withdrew into routines that at least provided structure and meaning, even if the larger cause they served appeared lost. The fortress that had once represented German martial confidence now contained thousands of men waiting for an ending they could neither prevent nor precisely predict. The concrete walls of Bergen's fortress remained physically unbreached, but the strategic fortress that had protected German naval operations in the Atlantic was dissolving. By the close of 1944, the base commander controlled an installation of undoubted military power that possessed diminishing strategic relevance. The noose was tightening, not through sudden or catastrophic events, but through the slow realization that even the most formidable fortress cannot survive when the state it defends is dying. The year 1944 had transformed Bergen from a place of strategic purpose into a military installation awaiting its final days. The commander and his staff understood this in their bones, even if they could not yet speak it openly. The fortress that once projected German power across the Atlantic now stood as a monument to ambitions that the future would render hollow. By the spring of 1944, Bergen had entered a new and profoundly different phase of its existence as a German fortress. The transformation was not sudden or announced. It crept forward like the slow onset of winter, marked not by a single catastrophic moment, but by the accumulation of smaller disappointments, smaller shortages, smaller withdrawals of purpose. The harbour that had once thrummed with the constant activity of departure and arrival, the urgent machinery of a fleet in its ascendancy, now began to settle into a rhythm defined by absence rather than presence. Fewer U-boats lined the concrete pens. The repair yards, which had once operated with such relentless precision that workers could barely remember the feel of sunlight, now experienced stretches of relative quiet that felt almost eerie to men accustomed to the soundtrack of hammers and welding torches. The difference was subtle to an outsider, but profound to those who lived within the fortress walls. It was the feeling of a machine that continued to run, but increasingly without purpose. Supply shortages crept into daily life like a slow-spreading stain. The diesel fuel that had once arrived with reliable regularity, that had been consumed by departing submarines with barely a second thought about replacement, now became subject to careful rationing. The fuel convoys from German refineries, increasingly vulnerable to Allied air attacks and disrupted rail lines, arrived with diminishing consistency. Storage tanks that had been kept perpetually full as insurance against any sudden operational demand now sat at half capacity, then lower. The men who managed logistics found themselves making calculations that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier, stretching every litre, prioritizing which operational patrols would receive fuel and which would be postponed. These decisions, made in office buildings inside the fortress, translated directly to the submarine crews who waited in their boats, who received orders that their departure was delayed again, who watched as the window for productive patrol seasons contracted further. The fuel shortage was not a dramatic crisis. It was a slow strangulation of capability. Each month's diminished allocation a quiet acknowledgement that Germany's war machine was consuming itself faster than it could produce replacements. Spare parts and technical materials presented an even more intractable problem. The submarines themselves were creatures of mechanical precision, machines that demanded constant attention, replacement components, specialized materials. A U-boat operating on extended patrol pushed every system to its limits. The diesel engines, the torpedo mechanisms, the periscope assemblies, the electrical systems that powered the boat underwater, all of these required parts that were manufactured in German factories or salvaged from captured equipment. But 1944 brought disruption to German manufacturing on an unprecedented scale. The Allied bombing campaign had intensified beyond what the German defense industry could sustain. Factories that produced submarine components faced destruction or severe damage. Transportation networks that moved these parts became increasingly unreliable. Bergen's supply officer found himself managing an impossible mathematics of attrition. Boats returned from patrol with damage that required replacement parts that simply did not exist in the stockpile. Temporary repairs became standard. Components were cannibalized from disabled U-boats to keep others operational. The engineering staff at Bergen, men of genuine technical competence who took pride in their work, found themselves performing wonders of improvisation, extending the operational life of equipment that should have been replaced, designing workarounds for missing components, making boats seaworthy through ingenuity when resources failed. The reduction in submarine sorties began gradually and then accelerated. In 1942 and early 1943, Bergen had been a place of constant movement. U-boats arrived, were serviced, departed. The operation cycle was relentless, efficient, purposeful. By the summer of 1944, the tempo of operations had slowed noticeably. Fewer boats departed each week, fewer boats returned. The pens that had housed submarines side by side, sometimes 3 or 4 boats to a single berth, now contained long stretches of empty concrete. For crews, this slowdown created a peculiar psychological torment. They remained in the fortress, confined within its walls, maintaining their training and their discipline, but increasingly aware that their purpose, to conduct patrols that inflicted damage on Allied shipping, was being curtailed. Submarine captains who had led multiple patrols found themselves waiting, attending briefings about potential operations that were cancelled or postponed, submitting to maintenance and retraining that felt repetitive when the prospect of actual patrol seemed increasingly uncertain. The operational intensity that had once defined a submarine sailor's existence, the sense of active engagement in the war, gave way to a new reality: the waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for fuel, waiting for supplies, waiting for a future that became harder to envision with each passing week. This transition affected different men in different ways, but it affected all of them. The U-boat arm had always been built on a particular psychological foundation, the sense that these men, these crews, these boats represented cutting-edge capability in service of their nation's war effort. That sense of purpose had sustained them through losses, through danger, through the grinding fatigue of extended patrols. But when the operational tempo declined, when the fortress that had once vibrated with purpose began to feel more like a waiting room than a forward combat position, that psychological foundation cracked. The officers and men maintained formal discipline. They continued to perform their duties with professional competence. The fortress itself, as a physical installation, continued to function, but something essential had been lost. Morale is a difficult thing to measure or describe, but those who lived within the fortress in 1944 understood that morale had become a problem. Letters from the front, conversations in barracks, the simple fact that fewer men were talking about future operations and more were discussing the increasingly ominous news from other theaters, all of this pointed to a shift in atmosphere. The pride that had once animated the U-boat service, the sense of belonging to an elite fighting force, gave way to something more like resignation. The fortress itself, for all its concrete and steel, could not protect against the psychological weight of isolation. Bergen in 1944 was increasingly cut off from the broader German war effort, increasingly aware of German defeats on other fronts. News from the Eastern Front grew steadily worse throughout the spring and summer. The Soviets advanced. German losses mounted. The Western Front, which had seemed secure when France was conquered, now appeared threatened. American and British bombers ranged across Germany with near impunity. The men of Bergen, reading the same newspapers and hearing the same official communiques as Germans elsewhere, understood that the war was not progressing as their leadership had promised. The fortress was supposed to be an instrument of German victory, but increasingly it felt like a fortress defending a crumbling nation. This disconnect between the grandeur of the physical installation and the diminishing prospects of the nation it served created a peculiar kind of despair. The bunkers were still formidable. The defenses were still strong, but they were defenses against what? The point of all this fortification, all this engineering achievement, had been to sustain an offensive war. As the war turned defensive, the fortress became something else, a monument to ambitions that would never be realized. The experience of crews waiting in the fortress developed its own routine, its own strange normalcy. Men trained, maintained equipment, performed administrative duties, and existed in a state of suspension. The fortress, for all its impersonality, had developed a civilization of sorts during years of operation. There were officers' clubs and enlisted clubs. There were organized recreational activities and meals served according to schedule. The German military, even in its late stages, maintained the forms and structures of military organization. But by 1944, these structures felt hollow. The recreations seemed pointless when one could not escape the awareness that the war was being lost. The meals were adequate, but increasingly monotonous as supply lines strained. The officers' clubs served their purposes, but the conversations within them were increasingly circumspect. Officers had learned to be careful about what they said and whom they said it to. The security apparatus of the Nazi state remained active, and a man could endanger himself and his comrades through excessive candor about the war's progress. So men lived within the fortress in a state of quiet tension, maintaining discipline and following orders, but increasingly aware that they were participants in a system that was consuming itself. The harbour itself reflected this transformation. In its years of peak operation, Bergen's water had been alive with activity. U-boats moving between berths, supply vessels unloading cargo, tugs maneuvering submarines into position. By the autumn of 1944, the harbour was noticeably quieter. The pens contained fewer boats. The docks saw fewer arrivals of supply convoys. The scale of operation that had made Bergen one of the primary nerve centres of German naval power had contracted significantly. For those who had come to the fortress during its years of ascendancy, who had seen it at the height of its operational intensity, this decline was difficult to witness. They were watching the institution they served being dismantled, not by enemy action, but by the simple mathematics of an unsustainable war. The enemy continued to attack. The RAF bombers still came at intervals, striking at infrastructure and infrastructure, but the German fortress was destroying itself through inability to sustain operations at the scale that had defined its purpose. The question of what Bergen's strategic value actually was had begun to trouble minds within the German command structure as well. The base had been conceived as a fortress from which German submarines could strike at Allied shipping in the Atlantic. That purpose had made sense when Germany possessed the capability to wage an offensive submarine war. But by 1944, the context had shifted fundamentally. The U-boats from Bergen could still sortie and potentially inflict damage on Allied shipping, but the overall trajectory of the submarine war was toward defeat. The newer, improved U-boats that German engineering promised, boats with greater underwater endurance, enhanced torpedoes, better defensive capability, remained largely in the realm of development and production schedules that could not keep pace with losses. Bergen remained a fortress, carefully maintained, still dangerous in a local sense, but its historical moment seemed to have passed. It had been constructed to serve a function in a war of German expansion. Now that war had shifted to one of German desperation, and a fortress designed for the first could not accommodate the second. The men of Bergen, submarine crews especially, carried within them a particular knowledge that others did not fully possess. They had seen firsthand what the Allies were capable of. They had operated against improving enemy defenses. They had learned through hard experience that every sortie carried increasing risk. Some of them had returned from patrols where their U-boats had barely escaped destroying Allied vessels through coordinated escort tactics and devastating new weapons. The convoy escort system had become lethally efficient. The Allied use of radar and sonar meant that the invisibility that had once been the submarine's greatest advantage was increasingly compromised. The crews knew, in a way that ground troops or Air Force personnel might not, exactly how far the balance of naval power had shifted. They had felt it in their hands, in their command of boats that increasingly struggled to accomplish their missions, in the mounting casualty lists of their comrades. And now, confined in the fortress, they waited, aware that when they departed on patrol, the risks would be greater than ever before. By late 1944, Bergen had entered a phase that might best be described as stagnation. The fortress continued to exist, continued to be maintained, continued to house thousands of military personnel and countless workers. Operations continued at a reduced tempo, but the sense that this installation was serving a vital, dynamic purpose in Germany's war effort had evaporated. It had become instead a place where men waited for orders, where systems functioned, but increasingly without connection to any larger strategic achievement. The fortress walls remained formidable. The concrete bunkers endured, but within them, the human beings who gave the installation meaning were experiencing the slow, corroding effects of isolation, shortage, and the mounting certainty that the war could not end in anything but German defeat. The pride had not entirely vanished. Professional soldiers maintained their standards, but pride was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain when the institution one served was no longer advancing toward any coherent objective, when each week's news from other theaters grew progressively darker, and when the man beside you in the crew quarters had begun to wonder, in quiet and careful terms, what would happen when the inevitable end arrived. The fortress at Bergen stood at a threshold in early 1945, suspended between what it had been and what it could no longer become. The U-boat base that once throbbed with the energy of conquest now faced a different kind of preparation, not for victory, but for defeat. German military planners, watching their world collapse across multiple fronts, had begun to confront an ugly reality. Norway itself, this distant prize seized in 1940, might soon become a battleground. Bergen, which had served as a launching point for submarines that ranged across the Atlantic, would need to transform itself into something altogether different, a fortress prepared to resist not Soviet armor rolling from the east or American forces breaking through in the west, but invasion from the sea. The deep fjords that had once sheltered U-boats would need to shelter soldiers. The repair yards that had restored damaged submarines would need to be defended. The concrete bunkers that protected equipment would need to protect men. Bergen was being reimagined as a last stand. The German High Command, already stretched impossibly thin across crumbling fronts, began routing reinforcements toward Norwegian territories. New garrisons arrived at Bergen with heavy equipment and orders to strengthen existing defensive positions. Engineers who had once built submarine bunkers now constructed anti-tank obstacles and reinforced gun emplacements overlooking the harbor approaches. Additional barracks rose from the frozen ground to house the swelling military population. Barbed wire was strung in new patterns. Machine gun nests were positioned to cover approaches from the sea and the valleys beyond. The base swelled with soldiers and supplies, transforming its character from specialized naval facility into something more militarily comprehensive, a garrison town within a fortress, bracing for a siege that many believed would never come, but that everyone prepared for anyway. The cold logic of German military organization demanded preparation for every contingency, even those deemed unlikely by those who lived and worked within the fortress walls. What made these preparations strange, almost surreal, was the quality of futility that clung to them. Officers and men who worked on the new fortifications understood, without needing to discuss it openly, that they were performing a kind of military theater. The Soviet army had already crossed into East Prussia and was pressing toward Berlin. Germany's western front was collapsing. The Reich that had conquered most of Europe was itself being conquered. Yet discipline and hierarchy demanded that Bergen be strengthened, as though Norway would be defended unto the last cartridge, even though everyone recognized that defending Norway meant nothing if Germany itself had ceased to exist. The irony was never stated aloud in official orders or formal meetings, but it hung in the air like Arctic fog. They were preparing to defend a position that had become strategically irrelevant in a war that was already lost. The younger soldiers, many of them recent conscripts, worked with something approaching mechanical efficiency, following orders, because that was what soldiers did. The older officers, the ones who had served since the beginning, worked with a different kind of grimness, as though effort and preparation might somehow forestall the inevitable. The U-boat operations themselves had dwindled to a shroud of their former intensity. By 1945, boats departing Bergen were no longer the sleek predators of the Atlantic wolf packs, but often hastily repaired hulls, sent on missions that everyone understood carried almost no prospect of success. The submarine arm that had once seemed capable of strangling Britain through commerce warfare had been systematically destroyed by Allied anti-submarine tactics and German strategic miscalculation. Yet the base maintained its installations and its crews, and new U-boats, including some of the experimental Type 21 designs that represented Germany's last hopes for technological salvation, were being fitted out and prepared for patrol. The repair shops that once worked ceaselessly to return damaged boats to service now struggled with shortages of materials and spare parts. Supply lines that had once brought fuel and provisions from across occupied Europe now depended on increasingly unreliable transportation routes. The base that had been a nerve center of German naval power was becoming something else entirely, a holding operation, a place where the machinery of war continued to turn, but with less and less connection to any larger strategic purpose. Life within the fortress had changed in texture and tempo. The routine that had once been defined by U-boat departures and returns, by the movement of submarines in and out of dry docks, by the constant flow of supplies and personnel, had become irregular and disjointed. Days stretched with less operational purpose. Crews waited longer between assignments. The sense of urgency that had once driven the base, the feeling that each boat that departed carried significance, had been replaced by something harder to define, a kind of resigned competence. Officers maintained discipline and standards because that was what they had been trained to do, but the underlying conviction that had animated the base, the belief that German U-boats were an arm of a winning strategy, had evaporated. Conversations in the barracks and officers' quarters had become more circumspect, conducted in hushed tones, with men careful about what they said and to whom. Rumors circulated constantly about the progress of the war, about possible armistice negotiations, about whether Norway would be evacuated or held at all costs. The fortress had become a place of waiting, and waiting corroded morale in ways that direct combat never could. The defences that were being erected around Bergen in these final months represented the last gasping assertion of German military will in Norway. Anti-tank guns were positioned in bunkers overlooking the harbour. Coastal fortifications were strengthened with additional concrete and reinforced gun positions. Minefields were laid in the approaches to the fjord. The Germans had learned from their losses in other theatres, and they understood that any invasion force would attempt to land forces from the sea. The harbour itself was studded with obstacles and protected by hidden gun emplacements. Soldiers trained in defensive positions, rehearsing responses to hypothetical amphibious assaults, though most of them had never seen combat. The preparations were thorough and militarily competent, the work of an organization that still possessed technical expertise and organizational capacity, even as its strategic situation had become hopeless. Yet those who oversaw these preparations, the base commander, his staff officers, the engineers directing construction, all seemed to understand that they were building for a war that had already been decided elsewhere, in the ruins of Berlin and on the frozen fields of the Eastern Front. The arrival of reinforcements brought new complications to the base's already strained resources. Food shortages became acute as the garrison expanded. The kitchens that had once fed submarine crews and support personnel now needed to sustain thousands of additional soldiers. Supply ships from occupied Europe came less frequently and carried less cargo. The base had been designed as a specialized naval facility, not as a large military garrison, and the infrastructure that had been built for one purpose did not easily accommodate the other. Heating fuel became precious in the Norwegian winter. Fresh water supplies required careful rationing. The officers responsible for logistics faced impossible tasks, trying to maintain adequate supplies for a garrison that had nearly doubled while supply lines deteriorated. They managed it, after a fashion, with the kind of determined pragmatism that characterized the German military, even in collapse. But everything was becoming scarcer and more difficult to obtain. What remained stable, even as everything else shifted, was the physical structure of the fortress itself. The massive concrete bunkers, built with the commitment of resources and labor that had characterized German construction in occupied territories, stood as they had stood for years, impregnable to anything except the overwhelming military force that was now approaching from multiple directions. The U-boat pens, those technological marvels that had been designed to protect submarines from air attack, still existed in their reinforced splendor. The dock facilities, the repair yards, the ammunition magazines carved into rock, the living quarters built deep underground, All of this remained intact and functional, a proof of German engineering and construction, even as the purpose for which it had been built had become obsolete. There was something both impressive and pathetic about these structures in early 1945, monuments to the ambitions of a regime that was dying, installations that would outlast their creators by decades, military works that would ultimately serve purposes entirely different from those for which they had been intended. The psychological dimension of these preparations cannot be overlooked. The soldiers who had arrived to strengthen Bergen's defences came from a Reich that was disintegrating. Some had been transferred from other theatres where they had experienced defeat firsthand. Others were relatively new conscripts who had grown up entirely within Nazi Germany and knew nothing but propaganda narratives about final victory and German invincibility. The contrast between what they had been told about German strength and what they could see with their own eyes, the shrinking territory, the destroyed cities, the mass casualties, created a cognitive dissonance that no amount of military discipline could entirely suppress. They were preparing defenses that seemed increasingly pointless, in a land that most of them believed would never be invaded because Berlin would defeat the Russians and make peace with the West before that ever happened. Yet they did the work. Officers gave orders, and men obeyed. The organizational machinery of the German military, even in its final months, still functioned with a kind of grim efficiency that was remarkable and disturbing in equal measure. The fortress at Bergen, as 1945 advanced, had become a microcosm of the larger tragedy consuming Germany. It was a place of contradictions, a naval base being prepared as an army garrison, a facility designed for offense being transformed into a position of defense, an installation representing years of military investment now being fortified against what everyone sensed was inevitable invasion. The men who served there were soldiers and sailors, caught between loyalty to military discipline and the personal knowledge that their cause was lost. They maintained routines and standards, not because they believed in ultimate victory anymore, but because routines and standards were all that remained. The fortress that had once symbolized German power and ambition, the base from which U-boats had ranged across the Atlantic, was becoming something else, a monument to persistence in the face of defeat, a military installation preparing for a siege that would never come, a place where the last chapter of German military history was being written in concrete and steel, and the quiet desperation of men who understood that the end was approaching but could not do anything except wait for it to arrive. The contrast between the scale of preparation and the clarity of coming defeat created a strange atmosphere that permeated every corner of the fortress. Officers moved through their days with faces carefully controlled, maintaining the appearance of command and purpose, even as the decisions that mattered were no longer being made at Bergen or in Norway, or even in Berlin anymore. They were being made in Moscow and Washington and London, by powers that had already decided Germany's fate. The base commander received orders to strengthen defenses, and he did so. He received orders to prepare contingency plans for possible evacuation, and he prepared them. He received orders to hold fast and resist invasion, and he established the mechanisms for resistance. But everyone, from the highest officer to the newest conscript, understood that these orders were part of a larger fiction, that Germany still controlled events, that the war could still be won, that preparation and discipline and loyalty might somehow alter the trajectory of history. Bergen, fortress and grave of German naval ambitions, stood waiting in the final winter of the war, armed and strengthened, ready for an invasion that would never come, prepared to fight a battle that the Reich was no longer capable of fighting. By 1945, the U-boat base at Bergen had transformed into something unrecognizable to those who had known it in its years of ascendancy. The concrete bunkers still dominated the harbour, their surfaces scarred by countless bomb fragments and weathered by Atlantic spray. The repair yards remained functional, though spare parts grew more difficult to source with each passing week. Fuel deliveries had become irregular, arriving in smaller quantities and at greater intervals. The base that once hummed with the energy of dozens of submarines preparing for patrol now operated in a kind of suspended animation, caught between the momentum of years of operations and the creeping paralysis of inevitable defeat. Officers walked their posts with the same precision they had maintained since 1941, but the men under their command sensed what everyone knew, but few spoke aloud. The end was coming, and it would not come on German terms. The final patrols that departed Bergen in the waning months of the war carried a different character than those that had sailed years before. In 1942 and 1943, U-boat crews had departed with purpose, briefed on specific convoy routes and tactical objectives, backed by intelligence summaries and calculations of probable tonnage to be sunk. They sailed believing in the wolf pack strategy, in Dönitz's grand design, in the notion that the Atlantic could still be contested and held. By 1945, these certainties had evaporated. The crews who departed Bergen now knew they were operating in an ocean dominated entirely by Allied forces. They knew that radar-equipped escort vessels surrounded any convoy they might encounter. They knew that aircraft would hunt them relentlessly. They knew, most importantly, that the war was being lost and had been lost for months, perhaps longer. Yet the orders came nonetheless, and the boats prepared to sail. The machinery of the military persisted through sheer inertia, because stopping was unthinkable, because surrender was not yet the official word, because admirals in Berlin still issued directives that filtered down through channels to the captains waiting in Bergen's concrete pens. Some of these final patrols achieved operational success by the standards that had long been established at the base. A U-boat would slip out of the harbour, navigate the Norwegian coast with care, and eventually encounter an Allied merchant vessel or a straggler from a convoy. The submarine would attack, sometimes successfully. A ship would be sunk or damaged. The boat would attempt to return to Bergen. The tonnage would be recorded. The crew would be debriefed. The submarine would be refueled and resupplied for another patrol. On the surface, these operations maintained the illusion of continuity, the sense that the Atlantic War still belonged partially to Germany, that Bergen's role as a forward base still mattered. But the context had changed irrevocably. Each sinking now represented a minor irritant to the Allies, rather than a strategic victory. Each U-boat that returned had consumed fuel and supplies that could not be easily replaced. Each crew member who went on patrol understood they were gambling not for victory, but simply to maintain the fiction that the war continued as it had before. The human cost of these final patrols assumed a quality distinct from earlier operations. In 1942 and 1943, crews had died in large numbers, yet they died in a context where the submarine force believed it was winning the tonnage war, where losses seemed like acceptable costs against the destruction being inflicted on the enemy. By 1945, young sailors died not for a war that was being won, but for one that was transparently being lost. They departed Bergen, knowing that survival statistics had shifted catastrophically in the Allies' favor. They knew of U-boats that had departed other bases and simply vanished, their fates unknown to the submariners waiting in the bunkers. They carried this knowledge with them as they climbed aboard their boats, checked their equipment, and took their positions for departure. Many were conscripts rather than volunteers, Men drafted into the submarine service from other branches of the military, forced into steel tubes that would descend beneath the surface to hunt and be hunted in darkness. Others were long-service submariners, veterans of multiple patrols, men who had seen boats that had sailed from Bergen disappear without returning, men who had witnessed the transformation of the U-boat arm from a force that believed it could win to a force that simply continued operating because the orders kept coming. The departures themselves had lost the ceremonial character they once possessed. In the early years of the base, commanding officers would address crew members before patrol. There would be acknowledgement of the difficulty of the mission ahead, recognition of the danger, assertion of German naval supremacy, and ultimate victory. The submarine would cast off with a kind of purpose, with men standing at attention on the deck, with the sense that they were participants in something historic. By 1945, the departures had become quietly mundane. A U-boat would slip out of its pen in the concrete bunker. It would move through the harbour with minimal fanfare. There would be no crowds to watch it go, no speeches about destiny or racial struggle or the 1,000-year Reich. The boat would pass the harbour defences, navigate into the fjord, and proceed toward the North Sea. The men at Bergen who watched it leave rarely spoke. They understood that some of these boats would not return, that their crews would be killed by depth charges or ramming, or simply by the pressure of the ocean crushing through their hulls. They understood that even if the boats returned, it meant nothing except that another patrol had been completed and another would eventually be ordered. Some of the final U-boats to depart Bergen never returned from their patrols. They were sunk by escort destroyers protecting convoys, by anti-submarine trawlers, by aircraft dropping patterns of depth charges that transformed the ocean into a chaos of explosions and rushing water. The boats went down, and with them died their crews. In the bunkers and repair facilities at Bergen, notices would eventually arrive confirming the loss. These notices arrived with increasing frequency as 1945 progressed. A boat that had departed 3 or 4 weeks earlier simply failed to make radio contact. Efforts to raise it by signal went unanswered. Eventually, command would acknowledge that the boat was lost. The crew was lost. Bergen would note the casualty, update its records, and prepare to receive another boat, or prepare for no boat at all, because there were fewer boats to deploy with each passing month. The families of the lost submariners would eventually be notified, though notification often lagged far behind the actual sinking, creating a liminal period where relatives did not know if their men were dead, or simply missing, or simply caught in the fog of a collapsing military communications system. Other U-boats that departed Bergen in these final months did return, but their returns carried a quality of weariness and resignation. The boats that came back bore signs of damage from the patrols they had endured. Some had been attacked by aircraft and had limped back to Bergen trailing smoke and carrying wounded. Others had escaped attack through luck or superior seamanship, but the crews that emerged from the hatches were haggard, their faces showing the strain of weeks underwater, in waters that had become demonstrably more dangerous. These returning crews would file into the debriefing spaces where officers would take their reports. There would be discussion of tonnage sunk, if any. There would be accounting of damage sustained, supplies expended, mechanical issues encountered. Then the crews would disperse. Some would be granted leave. Most would remain at the base, knowing that rest was temporary and that eventually they would be ordered back to sea, into boats that would be refueled and rearmed and prepared to depart once more. The repair facilities at Bergen, which had once operated with extraordinary efficiency to keep the submarine force operational and at sea, found their workload shifting in character. In earlier years, The yards had performed routine maintenance and critical repairs to boats damaged in combat. By 1945, many of the repairs were cosmetic or represented efforts to keep aging boats operational beyond their design specifications. The Type 7 submarines that formed the backbone of the force had been designed with a service life measured in years, but many had now been in continuous operation for nearly 5 years. They had been patched and welded and reinforced repeatedly. Their hulls bore the accumulated stress of years of depth charge attacks and underwater collisions and mechanical failures. The engineers at Bergen did what they could with the materials available to them, but it was increasingly clear that what they were doing was not extending the lives of these boats so much as postponing their inevitable sinking. They knew this, the captains knew this, the crews knew this. Yet the boats continued to be maintained and sent back to sea, because that was what the military required and what orders demanded. The psychological atmosphere at Bergen during these final months acquired a quality of numbness that contrasted sharply with the intensity of earlier years. In 1942 and 1943, even in the grim year of 1944, there had been a sense of dramatic struggle, a feeling that the outcome of the war hung in some balance, and that Bergen was one place where that balance was being contested. By 1945, this sense had dissipated entirely. The war was being lost decisively, lost beyond any possibility of recovery. The Soviet Union had advanced thousands of kilometers westward, and was now hammering at German borders in the east. The Western Allies had landed in Normandy and were driving eastward through France. Germany's cities were being reduced to rubble by bombing. Food was rationed. The Nazi regime was collapsing inward, consumed by internal conflicts and administrative dysfunction. Against this backdrop, the notion that a U-boat base in Norway could affect anything seemed increasingly absurd. The men at Bergen continued performing their duties because discipline demanded it, because disobedience could result in execution, because the alternative to continuing was chaos. But they performed these duties while maintaining an internal conviction that they were going through the motions of something that no longer truly mattered. The final patrols from Bergen did occasionally encounter Allied shipping and did occasionally succeed in sinking merchant vessels or damaging warships. These successes were recorded and reported up the chain of command, where they were incorporated into tonnage statistics and operational reports. But they were now isolated incidents in an ocean where the overall battle had already been decided. The Allies possessed such overwhelming superiority in naval forces, in aircraft, in escort capabilities, and in the ability to produce new ships faster than they were being sunk, that individual U-boat successes were merely pinpricks against the overall strategic picture. A U-boat sinking a merchant vessel in May of 1945 was like a soldier firing a rifle in a battle that was already decisively lost. The action might theoretically inflict casualties on the enemy, but it could not change the fundamental outcome. Every participant in the Bergen base could sense this. The final patrols were not conducted in hope of turning the tide, but in the grim knowledge that the tide had already turned and would never turn back. By late 1945, the departures from Bergen had become rare events. There were simply fewer submarines available for operations. Some had been transferred to other bases. Others had been damaged beyond practical repair. Still others had been lost entirely. The personnel at the base began discussing openly what had previously been spoken of only in whispers, that the war would end, that Germany would lose, that Bergen would not remain German much longer. These discussions violated military discipline and the security regulations that had governed the base since its establishment. But the regulations themselves had become increasingly meaningless as central authority fractured and the Nazi state entered its terminal phase. Men who had once faced execution for defeatist talk now openly questioned whether there was any point to continuing operations. Officers who still maintained rigid discipline found their authority eroding as the structure that had supported it crumbled. The end of Bergen's role as an active U-boat base did not come dramatically, but gradually, through attrition and administrative decay. Patrols continued at an ever-diminishing rate. Fewer boats departed, fewer boats returned. The repair facilities gradually reduced their operations as there were fewer boats to repair. Personnel were reassigned, discharged, or simply abandoned their posts and attempted to make their way back to Germany or find some refuge from the advancing Allied armies. The great fortress that had been built with such meticulous planning and such vast expenditure of resources and human labor now functioned as something between a naval installation and an occupied territory, a place where German military authority still nominally held sway, but where the substance of that authority had evaporated like water on hot stone. The submarine arm that had operated from Bergen, which had at its peak represented one of the most formidable military forces in the world, dissolved not in some apocalyptic final battle, but through quiet dissolution, through the last boats sailing on patrols from which fewer and fewer returned, through the recognition by all who remained that the war had been lost and that soon the fortress itself would fall to those who had always been stronger. The spring of 1945 arrived at Bergen like an unwelcome visitor whose presence could no longer be denied. Across the Reich, the machinery of war had begun its final, convulsive collapse. Soviet forces were flooding westward through Poland and into Germany itself. American and British armies had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into the German heartland. The skies belonged entirely to Allied aircraft. In this world of disintegrating authority and fracturing command structures, Bergen's fortress faced a crisis not of military strategy, but of fundamental purpose. The U-boat base that had operated for nearly 5 years as a symbol of German naval power now confronted an enemy far more dangerous than any convoy or warship, the enemy of irrelevance and the certainty of defeat. For Commandant Wolf, the base commander, May brought a cascade of contradictory orders that seemed designed to paralyze rather than inform. Berlin issued evacuation directives, then countermanded them within hours. "Destroy the facilities," the orders said. "Hold the base at all costs," they said next. "Prepare for a possible invasion. Prepare for a possible strategic withdrawal." The pattern repeated daily, sometimes hourly, reflecting the chaos consuming German military leadership as Hitler retreated into bunker fantasies, while the actual war slipped beyond recovery. Wolf was a career naval officer, caught between institutional loyalty and the survival instinct that whispered the war was already lost. His subordinates looked to him for clarity, but clarity had become a luxury the Third Reich could no longer afford. Every decision felt like choosing between versions of the same surrender. The base itself had transformed into something between a fortress and a tomb. The concrete bunkers that had once pulsed with urgent activity now echoed with the quiet footsteps of skeleton crews. The repair yards still maintained their equipment, but fewer U-boats arrived for servicing. The fuel depots remained stocked, but supply convoys from Germany became increasingly irregular. Officers walked the docks with forced composure, maintaining the appearance of operational readiness while privately acknowledging that the war had moved beyond their control. The crews sensed the change in atmosphere with the precision of men trained to read subtle shifts in their environment. Morale, once sustained by the mythology of German invincibility and ultimate technological triumph, had corroded into something harder and more bitter. the determination of men whose faith in victory had died but whose sense of duty remained. Intelligence reports arriving at Bergen painted a picture of catastrophe in slow motion. The Soviet advance was accelerating. In the west, Allied forces were already pushing toward Hamburg and the North Sea coast. If the Allies reached Norway before Germany could evacuate Bergen, the base and everyone in it would be trapped. Wolfe understood the mathematics of his position. Bergen was no longer a strategic asset. It was a liability. The boats that might have fled to Norwegian bases and continued operations were already sunk or captured. The industrial capacity to build new U-boats had been destroyed in German cities. The crews were exhausted from years of futile patrols. The cause itself had died, though the machinery of German command still produced orders as though purpose and power still existed. Some officers began to speak quietly of arrangements with neutral powers, of how to ensure that surrender might come with some dignity or protection. The U-boat flotillas that remained at Bergen had been reduced to a fraction of their former strength. Where once dozens of submarines had occupied the bunkers, now perhaps 5 or 6 boats lay dormant in their concrete shelters. These were not the celebrated vessels that had ranged across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. These were older models, damaged boats, experimental designs that had failed to deliver the technological miracles promised by German engineering. Their crews were thin on experience, many of them recruited from other branches of the military or trained in accelerated courses that compressed years of preparation into months. Some crews understood that sortying from Bergen now meant near certain sinking. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground where U-boats could operate with reasonable expectation of survival. It had become a graveyard where each patrol was a suicide mission with only the faintest possibility of return. Yet the orders to maintain readiness continued, and Bergen's remaining sailors prepared boats that they suspected would never see port again. Discipline at the base had begun to fracture in ways both obvious and subtle. The hierarchy that had governed life at Bergen for 5 years remained in place. Officers still held quarters separate from enlisted men, routines still structured the day, salutes were still rendered, and orders still obeyed. But something had shifted in the social fabric of the fortress. Some personnel had begun to disappear, slipping away into the Norwegian landscape or hiding in coastal villages where sympathetic civilians might shelter them. German administrators reported these desertions up the chain of command, but enforcement had become half-hearted. No one wanted to execute comrades for desertion, when desertion itself seemed like the rational response to impossible circumstances. The security apparatus that had once kept the base locked tight now turned a blind eye to men who recognized that loyalty to the Third Reich offered no guarantee of survival. Wolfe was aware of these disappearances, but chose not to press investigations. He too was beginning to consider options beyond the commands arriving from a Berlin that seemed increasingly untethered from reality. The fortress facilities themselves had become a source of dark irony for Bergen's remaining personnel. The bunkers that had seemed impregnable 5 years earlier now felt like tombs waiting to be sealed. The repair shops that had restored damaged U-boats to operational status sat largely idle, their crews maintaining equipment for boats that would never come back. The barracks that had housed thousands at the base's peak now contained only a fraction of that number, their empty corridors a reminder of the vast enterprise that had collapsed. The officers' club still maintained certain routines, regular meals, even the pretense of social life. But the atmosphere had become one of enforced normality imposed over deep anxiety. Officers discussed the war with increasingly abstract language, speaking of strategic withdrawals and regrouping rather than defeat. These verbal gymnastics fooled no one. Every man at Bergen understood that they were witnessing the end of something, and the question that consumed their thoughts was whether they would survive its conclusion. The intelligence picture available to Wolf grew grimmer by the day. Reports arrived of German military units surrendering wholesale to American and Soviet forces. The German army had lost entire army groups. German air defenses had collapsed. German industry lay in ruins. The technological innovations that the High Command had promised would turn the tide. New U-boat designs, guided torpedoes, revolutionary weapons systems had arrived too late and in quantities far too small to matter. The Thousand-Year Reich, proclaimed with such certainty in the speeches and propaganda that Bergen's personnel had absorbed for years, was contracting into a nightmare of weeks, or perhaps only days. Some officers began to speak of Hitler's death, rumors arriving from Berlin through official channels that the Führer was already dead or dying. Others spoke of shadow governments and continuation of the war from fortified Alpine positions. These were the fantasies of men drowning in denial, and Wolf recognized them as such. As May deepened, Wolf faced a series of tactical decisions that carried implications far beyond the immediate operational level. Should Bergen's remaining boats attempt to escape? Should the base be prepared for destruction? Should supplies be hidden for use in a possible guerrilla campaign? Should civilians and support staff be evacuated to save them from capture? Each option carried risks. Boats that sortied from Bergen in May 1945 were almost surely facing destruction. Destroying the facilities meant confirming to the men under his command that their years of work had been for nothing. Hiding supplies suggested desertion or cowardice. Evacuating civilians might be construed as abandoning the base. Wolf made his decisions carefully, trying to preserve as much flexibility as possible while giving the appearance of following orders. He ordered preparations for evacuation while simultaneously strengthening defensive positions. He authorized the remaining U-boats to prepare for sortie while quietly ordering captains to use their judgment about whether departure was tactically wise. The final days of April and first days of May brought a succession of events that crystallized Bergen's situation. News arrived of Hitler's suicide. Within hours, orders came regarding the succession and the continuation of military command. German forces in Denmark had surrendered to the Allies. Dutch forces had surrendered. German forces in Italy had surrendered. The world that Bergen's personnel had inhabited was collapsing faster than anyone had anticipated. The broadcasts on the base radio grew more desperate, filled with calls for sacrifice and loyalty, even as the reality on the ground made such calls seem almost obscene. Officers began to speak more openly about the inevitability of defeat. Some talked of ensuring that the base would not be destroyed, that Bergen might pass into Allied hands intact, preserving the infrastructure and the buildings that had been constructed with such effort. This represented a quiet revolution in thinking, from defense unto death to a new concern for preservation and survival. Wolf held a series of private meetings with his senior officers in the final week of April and first days of May. These conversations were never fully documented, and the content remained discreet. But the result became clear. There was an understanding among the officer corps that Bergen would not fight to the last man. The base would be defended only long enough to establish its status as a legitimate military position, not as a fortress that had surrendered without firing a shot. But there would be no Alamo, no last stand in the bunkers. The conversations also touched on practicalities, how to ensure that certain officers and men could disappear into the Norwegian landscape if necessary, how to establish relationships with Norwegian resistance elements who might provide shelter or safe passage. These were delicate matters that could be discussed only in whispers, and only among men who had come to understand that survival sometimes required seeing beyond the chain of command. The psychological atmosphere at Bergen in these final days defied simple description. The fortress had been a place of purpose for nearly 5 years. The men who served there had dedicated themselves to the mission of striking at Allied shipping, of defending German interests, of building something that would outlast the war itself. That purpose had now evaporated. The future stretched before Bergen's personnel as a void. It would be capture, or evacuation, or perhaps flight into a Norway that might kill them as readily as any Allied soldier. Yet the discipline remained. The uniforms were still worn with precision. The salutes were still rendered. The orders were still obeyed. Bergen's personnel continued to maintain their fortress even as they confronted its coming obsolescence. This contradiction between form and substance, between the continued pretense of operational readiness and the deep certainty of imminent defeat, characterized the final days of the base as a functioning German military installation. The last chapter had not yet been written, but everyone could see the ending approaching like a ship emerging from the fog. The spring of 1945 arrived in Bergen not as a season of renewal, but as the prelude to an ending that even the most hardened commanders could no longer deny. The third week of April brought clear skies and warming temperatures to the Norwegian coast, yet the brightness seemed almost mocking, a natural world indifferent to the collapse unfolding in the harbour below. The U-boat base that had operated for nearly 5 years with military precision now existed in a state of controlled disintegration. Orders arrived from Berlin, contradictory and increasingly desperate, each message carrying the weight of a regime in its final convulsion. Some commands demanded the fortress be held at all costs. Others suggested evacuation. Still others seemed to arrive from a leadership so removed from reality that they might as well have been messages from another planet. The officers and men stationed at Bergen existed in an unbearable limbo, caught between duty to an ideology that was visibly collapsing and the human instinct to survive what came next. The harbour that had sheltered the grey sharks of the Atlantic wolf packs was about to become a graveyard of its own making. The decision to scuttle came not from a single order, but from 1,000 unspoken understandings that rippled through the base like a tide no one could reverse. By late April, only a handful of U-boats remained at Bergen, far fewer than the dozens that had crowded the moorings in the glory years. These were vessels that could not sail, boats whose engines were damaged beyond quick repair, whose crews had been reduced to skeleton teams, whose captains understood with grim clarity that any attempt to sortie into waters now completely dominated by Allied forces was equivalent to ordering their crews to their deaths. The commanding officer faced an impossible choice with no good options. If the U-boats were left intact, and the Allies captured the base, the enemy would gain functional submarines, or at minimum intact hulls and equipment that could be studied and eventually reverse-engineered. If they remained in the harbour awaiting a German counter-offensive that would never come, they would eventually be taken by Norwegian forces operating under Allied command. The alternative was the ancient maritime tradition of destroying one's own ships rather than see them seized. It was an act of defiance and an admission of defeat all at once. In the final week of April, the order was given quietly to prepare the boats for scuttling. The work began at night, when the long Arctic twilight made darkness almost impossible, but shadows grew deep enough to provide concealment from Allied reconnaissance aircraft that now flew with impunity over Norwegian waters. The crews moved through their vessels with methodical efficiency. The same discipline that had characterized their service now turned toward destruction instead of operation. Seacocks were opened, valves in the hull that would allow water to flood into the boat's interior, ensuring that the vessel would sink to the harbour bottom in depths where salvage would be impossible. Demolition charges were placed at critical points throughout each submarine, positioned to rupture the pressure hull and guarantee that even if the boats settled on the bottom, any attempt to raise them would result in their complete destruction. Equipment that could not be moved was smashed or booby-trapped. Torpedoes were either fired into safe depths or disabled and scuttled alongside their parent vessels. The work was exhausting and surreal. These men had spent years maintaining their boats with devotion bordering on religious fervor, and now they were methodically destroying them with equal commitment. Officers supervised the work with faces that showed nothing, emotions locked away behind military bearing. The crews moved through the final night of their submarine's existence with the ritualistic quality of a funeral, because that is what it was. The explosions began just before dawn on the 26th of April, when the harbour was silent, except for the sound of water lapping against concrete and metal. The first detonations came from inside the submarine hulls as internal charges rupture the compartments that had been specifically engineered to withstand enormous pressure from the outside. The boats lurched and settled, their sterns rising briefly into the air as their bows sank beneath the surface. Some went down in minutes, their fate determined by the efficiency of their own destruction. Others listed slowly, water pouring in through seacocks and ruptured compartments, their descent marked by the groan of metal and the screams of air escaping through flooding compartments. The harbour filled with the roar of explosions, the shriek of metal tearing, and the sounds of an entire category of warship being systematically erased from existence. More than a dozen U-boats were scuttled in Bergen's harbour during those early morning hours. Each one represented countless hours of construction, millions of Reichsmarks in materials and labour, and the accumulated knowledge of the German submarine service. Within a few hours, they lay on the harbour bottom. Their mission ended not in triumph, but in the cold waters of Norway. The German naval officers who watched from the dock stood with their hands clenched, many of them understanding that they had just witnessed the physical manifestation of the Third Reich's defeat. Yet the scuttling of the submarines was only part of the chaos that gripped Bergen in those final days of April. The German command decided that if the base could not be held or evacuated, then as much of its strategic value as possible should be destroyed to deny it to the enemy. Demolition teams were organized to destroy the fuel storage facilities that had supplied U-boats for half a decade. Massive explosions rocked the harbour area as the depot containing hundreds of thousands of litres of diesel fuel detonated in catastrophic fireballs. The shock waves from the blasts rattled windows in the town and sent plumes of black smoke rising thousands of meters into the sky. The infrastructure that had been so painstakingly constructed, the concrete bunkers that had survived Royal Air Force bombing raids, the repair shops where skilled technicians had performed mechanical miracles on damaged boats, the supply warehouses, the administrative buildings, was being erased by the very hands that had built it. Each explosion represented a decision that the fortress was no longer worth defending, that the future it had been constructed for would never arrive. The German military was destroying its own installations, not because the Allies were storming the gates, but because the men in command understood that within days, or at most weeks, the base would be occupied, and everything left standing would become a gift to the enemy. The sound of those explosions echoed across Bergen's harbour like a requiem for 5 years of struggle and sacrifice. The dissolution of military organization at the base proceeded with a strange mixture of discipline and desperation that characterized Germany's final collapse in 1945. Officers began burning documents, intelligence reports, operational summaries, technical drawings, all the records that had accumulated during the base's operation. The fires burned in metal drums throughout the facility, and the ashes rose into the spring air, carrying 5 years of naval history away on the wind. Equipment that could not be destroyed quickly was abandoned. Personnel rosters were issued with evacuation instructions, though no one seemed entirely certain where the evacuees were supposed to go, or whether the orders would be honored or countermanded before they could be carried out. The barracks that had housed thousands of submariners and support staff emptied in stages as units received orders to march toward the interior of Norway or toward positions being established as a final defense against invasion. The routine that had governed the base since 1941, the schedules of patrols and repairs, the hierarchy of command, the certainty of purpose, dissolved into confusion. Men who had served under strict discipline for years suddenly found themselves in a vacuum, their orders either absent or contradictory, their future utterly uncertain. The fortress became a haunted place, its corridors and bunkers gradually emptying, the sounds of organized military operations replaced by the occasional footsteps of men carrying out final tasks. The harbor itself became a vision of apocalypse as destruction accelerated during the final days before German authority simply evaporated from Bergen. Additional ships beyond the U-boats were scuttled, patrol vessels, minesweepers, supply ships, anything that could be considered naval property. The harbor bottom filled with German military vessels, their hulls settling into the mud in attitudes of resignation. Some ships burned before sinking, fires consuming their superstructures while their hulls remained stubbornly afloat until the internal explosions and opened seacocks finally pulled them under. The water itself seemed to change color, becoming streaked with oil and contaminated by the leaking fuel and materials from dozens of sunken vessels. Debris floated on the surface, wooden crates, equipment, papers, the detritus of military occupation. The once proud German naval base now resembled a ship graveyard, a harbor filled with the corpses of vessels that had been built at enormous cost and were being destroyed at an equally enormous cost in terms of lost resources and lost potential. Officers observing the destruction understood they were witnessing the physical manifestation of Germany's defeat. There was no way to reverse what was happening, no possibility of recovering what was being destroyed. Bergen was being unmade before their eyes. The psychological impact of witnessing the destruction of one's own military installations operated at a level that the men of the base could barely articulate, even to themselves. Some personnel worked methodically through their assigned destruction tasks with the blank expression of automatons, simply completing assignments without allowing themselves to fully comprehend what they were doing. Others moved through the base's final hours with a kind of grim defiance, viewing the destruction as a final act of resistance against the enemy, even though the enemy was not yet present. A few men began to question openly whether the destruction made sense, whether it was truly necessary to demolish everything rather than attempting some kind of organized retreat or capitulation. The senior officers, the men who had spent nearly 5 years commanding this fortress, seemed to age visibly during the final week of April. They bore the weight of responsibility for what was being destroyed and for the fates of the thousands of men under their command, who now faced an uncertain future. Some appeared to accept the destruction as inevitable. Others seemed haunted by the understanding that they were presiding over the dissolution of something they had been instructed was permanent and important and German. The base that had been constructed as a monument to Nazi military might was being disassembled by its own defenders, and that dismantling carried a symbolic weight that transcended its practical meaning. The last organized German military presence in Bergen faded away during the final days of April, though the exact moment when authority formally transferred from German to Norwegian and British hands remains unclear even in historical records. Some units marched away toward the interior of Norway. Some small garrisons remained in heavily fortified positions, waiting for orders that might come to fight or might come to surrender. Some personnel simply abandoned their posts and attempted to make their way toward Germany or toward the Austrian Alps, where rumors suggested the Nazi leadership might make a final stand. The U-boat crews who had survived the scuttling of their boats were distributed among various German units or left to their own devices. Some were incorporated into defensive positions being prepared against potential invasion. Others were given travel documents and leave, essentially being released from service to fend for themselves. The base's commander issued final orders and then seemed to simply disappear, whether evacuated by aircraft or captured by advancing forces, or simply walking away from his command, remains a matter of historical uncertainty. The fortress that had been described in official propaganda as impregnable and permanent was abandoned not in a moment of dramatic climax, but in a cascade of small decisions and departures that accumulated into a total evacuation. By the final week of April, the U-boat base was largely empty of organized German military personnel, though scattered soldiers remained in various positions throughout the facility. The bunkers and fortifications stood empty in those final days before liberation, their massive concrete walls making them seem almost indestructible even as the German military machine that had justified their construction simply ceased to exist. The underground repair facilities, carved into the living rock and covered with concrete so thick that bombs could barely damage them,